What if your go-to romantic gesture involved offering a morsel of pork fat painted with astrology symbols, while reciting a prayer to Aphrodite in perfect old French? What if failing to include a single rose petal in your love letter meant instant rejection, or worse, a summons to your beloved's parents' court? What if your date night required you to polish a jewel until it shone like the Holy Grail itself? Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. In the grand tapestry of medieval Europe, romance was less about swiping right and more about decoding portents and chicken entrails. Imagine a world where your chances with Lady Avellini hinged on the price you paid for an onion ring at market, or on whether your wax seals arrived intact. For thousands of young men and women, love was an intricate dance of superstition, ritual, and downright bizarre advice. Over the next few segments, we'll explore the most outlandish tips and tricks, from the esoteric to the absurd, that our medieval ancestors swore by to win hearts, or at least avoid public humiliation. The astrology of affection. Before Cupid wielded his arrows, medieval love counselors consulted the stars. Court astrologers charted the positions of Venus, Mars, and Jupiter to determine the perfect day and hour for a lover's meeting. If Venus occupied the sign of Cancer, you were told to adorn your tunic with silver thread. If Mars was rising in Scorpio, you were advised to avoid wearing red, lest you appear too aggressive. One enduring handbook, attributed to an anonymous 14th century Parisian scribe, even recommended fainting slightly if a sudden lunar eclipse occurred during your courtship. This dramatic gesture was said to prove your undying devotion. Of course, collapsing in a faint could also prompt concerns of hidden illness or even witchcraft, so only the bravest suitors dared to follow this advice. Pork fat and love potions. Forget chocolates and champagne. For many medieval suitors, the secret ingredient to melting a lover's heart was rendered pork fat. But not just any lard. The fat had to be obtained on the night of a new moon, from a pig fed exclusively on aromatic herbs like rosemary and thyme. This enchanted fat was melted and mixed with ground rose petals, saffron, and a pinch of crushed pearl. The resulting ointment was applied to a handkerchief and discreetly tucked into a lady's sleeve during Mass. If she inhaled the scent and experienced a slight dizziness, it was considered a sign that the potion was working, though legend warns that overdose led to vivid hallucinations of dancing unicorns. Jewel polishing as courtship. In an era when jewelry symbolized both wealth and virtue, polishing a gem to perfection was an act of courtship in itself. A suitor would present his beloved with a raw, uncut gemstone, often a modest garnet or smoky quartz, and demonstrate his devotion by hand polishing it until it gleamed. This process, which could take days by candlelight, served as proof of patience, skill, and seriousness of intent. Some craftsmen even included microscopic engravings inside rock crystal spheres, invisible to the naked eye. Lovers carried small magnifying glasses to discover these hidden messages. If the engraving read, Amor vincit omnia, the recipient knew her suitor had gone to extraordinary lengths. The onion ring omen. At medieval fairs, onion rings were more than carnival snacks. They were medieval polygraphs. A young man purchasing an onion ring was expected to pay exactly 1 denier. Any more, and he was deemed financially reckless. Any less, and he seemed stingy. After frying, the suitor would present the ring to his lady, who would tuck it into her hair or brooch as a token of acceptance. If the ring snapped mid-fry, it was an omen of bad fortune, and a quick exit from the market square was advised to avoid curses. Love letters and wax seals. In a time when a handwritten letter took hours to compose, the wax seal was the ultimate authenticity test. Lovers carried secret signet rings that bore their family crest. Pressing it into warm wax guaranteed that no rival courier could alter the message. Yet metaphysical guidelines dictated which color wax to choose. White for pure intentions, deep crimson for burning passion, and pale yellow for timid affection. A single drop of scented water, rose, lavender, or lily mixed into the wax was said to imbue the letter with lasting memory. One unfortunate suitor accidentally used mustard oil instead of lavender, resulting in the letter turning brittle and yellow within days, which his beloved interpreted as a sign of insincerity. Dream interpretation by candlelight. Rather than texting sweet dreams, medieval daters often sought nocturnal visions for romantic guidance. Before sleeping, a hopeful suitor would place a silver coin under his pillow, write his name on a sheet of parchment, and recite a prayer to Morpheus, god of dreams. If the coin was missing come morning, it meant the dream had been consumed by the gods, prompting a fresh coin and a repeat of the ritual. Dream interpreters, located near cathedral precincts, charged exorbitant fees to decode encounters with white doves, a meeting in the market, black cats, caution against gossip, or naked ancestors, family disapproval. The ring toss ritual. For those who couldn't afford jewelry, the humble ring toss offered a makeshift alternative. During village festivals, young men purchased simple wooden rings and attempted to toss them onto the finger of their desired maiden. Successful landings were celebrated with a horn and a tumbler of mead. Failures meant the suitor had to kneel and present a song or poem before trying again. While this could bolster confidence, it also exposed participants to heckling crowds. One squire threw 9 perfect rings before missing the 10th. His subsequent embarrassment was so great that chroniclers later wrote how he fled to a monastery for penance. The perfumed handkerchief exchange. In the absence of modern perfume, personal scents came from scented gloves, pomanders, and handkerchiefs dipped in aromatic oils. Lovers exchanged these fragrant tokens during dances. The rule was simple. The exchange had to occur in the moonlight, with each participant reciting a 2-line verse extolling the virtues of the scent. "O lavender sweet, your petals divine, may your breath entwine forever with mine." Breaking the rhyme scheme was considered a bad omen, potentially dooming the relationship before it began. Bloodletting for passion. Perhaps the oddest advice of all was the belief that bleeding yourself could prove the depth of your love. By allowing a small cut on your wrist, performed by a barber surgeon at the edge of a jousting field, you showed you were willing to sacrifice your lifeblood. The blood, mixed with rose water and applied to a ribbon, was then tied around your beloved's wrist. If the ribbon lasted a fortnight without unraveling, your bond was deemed unbreakable. Needless to say, infections were common, and some critics likened the practice to courting death rather than affection. The final word, a prayerful bow. After all the rituals, charms, and omens, a suitor's final act was often a humble, prayerful bow before a statue of the Virgin Mary or a local saint. He would recite a short litany: "Grant, O Blessed Mother, that my heart's desire may be pure, my intentions honorable, and my fortunes true," before returning home to await his beloved's response. The waiting period could last weeks, during which friends and family offered their own superstitious guidance: to carve the response into a wooden panel, hide it in a loaf of bread, or cast it into the river under a full moon. By today's standards, these practices may seem wildly elaborate, even absurd. Yet for medieval hearts yearning for connection, each ritual offered a sense of control in an unpredictable world. In the next segment, we'll dive into the more scandalous sides of medieval courtship, secret midnight rendezvous, love's forbidden languages, and the epic tales of star-crossed knights and their fair maidens. Stay with me, the strangest tales are yet to come. The moon hung like a polished silver coin above the battlements as Sir Roland crept through the ivy-clad archway, his heart hammering louder than the distant hooves of the patrolling guard. Midnight rendezvous were forbidden in every charter of chivalry, yet every fiber of his being urged him onward. Clutched in his gauntlet fist was a folded parchment, its edges scorched to resemble a love letter written by a dying candle's flame. Lady Isabeau waited in the shadow of an elswept courtyard, her pale surcoat catching the glimmer of torchlight as she slipped him a perfumed handkerchief, violet oil, she whispered, from her grandmother's garden. The exchange was silent, save for their shallow breaths, and yet in that moment they spoke 1,000 words: devotion, desperation, and the delicious thrill of forbidden passion. These secret midnight meetings were a staple of scandalous medieval courtship. Hidden passageways beneath abbeys, hollowed tree trunks and moonlit groves, even the backs of oversized tapestry hangings in noble halls, all served as clandestine stages for lovers who dared to defy family feuds, political alliances, or the ever-watchful gaze of the church. One chronicler recalled how Lady Matilda whispered through a grated confession stall to her suitor, a young monk named Brother Alan, though that particular liaison ended in scandal when a suspicious novice overheard their murmured verses and alerted the abbess. And then there was the language of love, not French, Latin, or the rough-tongued dialect of the peasants, but a secret code known only to those initiated into the art of amatory cipher. Letters were sent with invisible ink made from elderberry juice. The true message emerged only after being gently warmed over a brazier. Some lovers went further, embedding riddles within acrostic poems. The first letter of each line spelled out a name, a vow, or a clandestine meeting place. One famous troubadour composed a ballad so cunningly masked that only his beloved's personal gold signet ring could reveal its hidden couplets when pressed onto the parchment. But not all whispers of the heart were so harmless. In certain courts, messages were delivered by trained ravens, their tiny leather saddlebags containing scrolls tied with silk ribbon. The birds were taught to return to a specific window ledge at dawn, ensuring that only the intended pair shared the secret verses. Yet mold and misdirection could betray even the most careful plan. Duke Humbert's raven once alighted on the wrong castle turret, and the love letter meant for his mistress found its way into the hands of her aunt, who promptly arranged a forced marriage for her niece at sunrise. For those who craved grand gestures, nothing outshone the legendary rose and dagger ritual practiced in Florence in the late 13th century. A suitor presented his beloved with a single red rose pierced through with a silver stiletto, a potent symbol of love and sacrifice. To accept the gesture, the lady had to remove the dagger and smell the rose's petals, an act construed as embracing both the beauty and the danger of love. Rejecting the offering, by contrast, required dropping the rose and stepping back 3 paces, a public rebuke that often led to duels or demands for public apology. Across the Channel in Anglo-Norman England, lovers sought refuge in courtly masks, extravagant theatrical performances where masks concealed identities and hearts laid bare in allegory. A nobleman might disguise himself as a golden stag, pursuing his quarry through a maze of live hedges, while the maiden appeared as a moonlit swan, glimpsed only at the margin of torchlight. The audience cheered at each near capture, but the true play was always behind the scenes. At the last curtain, the stag would kneel, remove his mask, and present the swan with a silver feather, his secret vow of eternal fidelity. Yet for every whispered sonnet or covert meeting, there were darker, more perilous customs. The waxened-out ceremony called upon unwed couples to sit before a burning taper, each pronouncing a vow of truth. If the flame sputtered or flared violently, witnesses declared it an omen of betrayal, and the pair could be separated by a judge's decree. Some crafty pairs bribed the candlemaker to add a drop of oil that guaranteed a steady, unwavering flame, but discovery of such tampering led to public penance in the pillory. Not everyone employed high drama. Peasants devised simpler, folk remedies for love's uncertainties. One popular trick involved placing a thorn from a rose bush and a clove of garlic under the pillow, reciting, "Rose for sweetness, garlic for might, which enters the heart this very night." Dreams were then interpreted at dawn. If the rose thorn pricked the sleeper's cheek, it foretold imminent courtship. If the garlic scent lingered, it warned of deceit or jealousy. In medieval Spain, the art of floriography flourished among the noble classes. Lovers exchanged bouquets with careful symbolism. The fiery crimson of a carnation spoke of deep admiration, while the pale blue forget-me-not whispered undying remembrance. A bouquet containing both heliotrope and lilac declared secret love, whereas the bold presence of a yellow poppy conveyed jealousy, or worse, a caution against entanglements altogether. Misinterpret a cinder's floral choice, and you risked insulting their very soul. Meanwhile, in the Byzantine world, concubines and courtesans taught an even more elaborate system of tactile signals. During court gatherings, a gentle squeeze of the right hand beneath the table meant, "I await your note at the eastern garden gate," while a subtle tap on the left foot signified, "Beware, guards pass soon." Some aristocrats wore gloves stitched with fine gold embroidery that concealed tiny vibrating bells. These bells jingled softly if the wearer's pulse quickened, alerting their secret paramour to meet under cover of shadows. Of course, all this clandestine romance could end in heartbreak, or, in extreme cases, execution. Queen Blanche of Navarre famously executed 2 noblemen for sending her a jeweled acrostic poem deemed too passionate for her royal station. In Eastern courts, a widow who violated the widow's window, her appointed mourning period, by engaging in fresh courtship faced property seizure, exile, or even charges of treason against her late husband. Yet despite the risks, medieval hearts continued to bleed ink, spill candle wax, and whisper through lattice windows. The thrill of espionage mingled with the purity of devotion, creating an intoxicating tapestry of love that transcended feudal boundaries and religious strictures. As Dawn's pale fingers brushed the sky, Sir Roland pressed a single kiss to Lady Isabeau's glove and slipped away into the labyrinth of cloisters. She watched until his silhouette vanished into the morning mist, clutching her violet-scented handkerchief to her breast. Their secret would survive another day, though they both knew that every stolen moment carried the weight of honor, reputation, and the ever-looming threat of discovery. In the next part of our journey, we'll explore how medieval fashions themselves became instruments of seduction, corsets wired with hidden compartments, dyes infused with rosewater lust, and embroidered motifs that spoke volumes to those who knew how to read them. Stay close. The path of courtship grows ever more intricate. While love letters, glances, and shadowy trysts played their part in medieval courtship, perhaps no language was more provocative or perilous than that of fashion. In an era when even a flash of ankle could cause an ecclesiastical crisis, garments became the armor and arsenal of romantic warfare. Every hemline, every sleeve, every cent stitched into a tunic whispered some secret message of intent, desire, or defiance. Start with the party-colored hose, a fashion craze that swept through 14th century Europe and left moralists gasping. Men would wear one leg of their trousers a different color than the other, often the colors of their family's coat of arms or, more scandalously, the favorite colors of a beloved lady. This was no mere aesthetic whim. If a knight wore green on the left and blue on the right, and Lady Juliet just happened to wear blue and green to Mass each Sunday, well, gossip wrote itself. It was the medieval version of sliding into someone's DMs, except you were shouting your feelings with your pants. But men were not the only ones broadcasting coded signals through fashion. Noble women adorned their gowns with embroidered messages that only the literate could decipher. At first glance, a border of golden thread might seem purely ornamental. But look closer, and the scrollwork might spell out a line of poetry, perhaps a Latin line from Ovid about longing, or a French proverb about unrequited love. These gowns turned every social event into a literary guessing game. The wrong translation, of course, could lead to embarrassment or a duel. Headwear, too, became an arena of flirtation and defense. Consider the hennin, those towering cone-shaped hats popular among French nobility. They weren't just fashion statements. Women often tied long veils to the tips of their hennins, and if a veil fluttered in your direction during a feast or fair, it could mean anything from "I see you" to "meet me in the garden after Vespers. The church tried to ban hennins repeatedly, claiming they were instruments of vanity and obstructions to humility. But for many women, they were more like antennas for attraction. And what of scent? In a time before perfume as we know it, lovers crafted their own fragrant formulas using herbs, oils, and even rendered animal fat. A popular love balm contained rose oil, clove, cinnamon, and a splash of aged vinegar, meant to be dabbed behind the ears or inside gloves. Some carried pomanders, small, decorative orbs filled with aromatic resins, on chains around their necks. If a woman offered a man a sniff of her pomander, she was inviting him to experience not just her scent, but her inner world. In this way, scent served both to attract and to distract from the less pleasant odors of a world without soap or sewers. Yet in some courts, particularly in Italy and southern France, perfumes were also used strategically. A nobleman might anoint his tunic with lavender if he wished to appear calm and controlled, or vetiver if he wanted to seem powerful and earthy. Ladies might lace their garments with rosemary to signal chastity, or musk if they were feeling particularly bold. Entire manuals were written on the symbolism of smell. One 15th century Venetian text listed over 100 scent combinations and what emotional states they evoked in the opposite sex. Clothing could also hide secrets, literally. Corsets were sometimes sewn with tiny compartments, just large enough to hold a love note or a locket of hair. In the German principalities, some women wove charms into the hems of their undergowns, small tokens blessed by village herbalists or cunning women, believed to stir the affections of the desired party. Others wore rings with moving compartments, where a pinch of powdered rose root or crushed saffron might be stored for emotional influence. And then there were the dangerous accessories. Consider the lover's token, a tradition in which a woman would gift a knight a favor, usually a handkerchief or ribbon, to wear on his armor or around his sword hilt. Most of these were innocent enough, but some carried coded stitching or symbols only the knight would understand. A red knot might mean passion, a white braid might represent loyalty, and a black thread woven among gold could signify a shared secret or a betrayal yet to be revealed. Misinterpreting the symbol could ruin reputations or end with a body floating face down in a moat. Among the peasantry, fashion took on a different tone. Without the luxury of silks or perfumed balms, rural lovers relied on ritual garments and rustic tokens. In parts of England and Wales, young women would wear a simple smock to bed on Midsummer's Eve and whisper, "I bid my true love come to me / as I do dream this night." If they dreamed of a man offering them water or bread, he was thought to be their destined spouse. If they dreamt of fire or wolves, they were to remain single for another year. In Eastern Europe, particularly in Slavic regions, ribbon rituals were common. A girl would tie different colored ribbons into her hair: green for hope, red for courage, white for purity, blue for fidelity. Boys would approach her during village festivals and attempt to untie a ribbon. Each color removed had its own consequence. A boy who untied a green ribbon might be allowed to dance. A red one could mean a chaste kiss. But a blue ribbon? That meant the couple would be expected to court under the watch of chaperones. Remove the wrong ribbon, and you'd better be ready to talk to her father by sundown. Colors themselves held power. In medieval France, yellow was associated with jealousy and treason, while blue suggested loyalty and honesty. Purple, being rare and expensive, signified power, but also veiled desire. Red was double-edged. On one hand, it represented love and vitality. On the other, it was also linked with sin, temptation, and moral decline. One monk described a woman in red as a flame dressed for confession. In cities like Prague and Vienna, young men would also adorn their cloaks with stitched runes or symbols, borrowed from pagan traditions, meant to invoke good fortune and love. One popular rune meant mutual longing, while another offered protection from heartbreak. Authorities tried to outlaw these charms, but their use only grew, whispered down through generations as old wisdom, not easily forgotten. Perhaps the strangest use of fashion in romance came from a court in Burgundy, where a brief trend known as mask mourning took root. When a lover departed, whether for war, pilgrimage, or trade, a woman might don a black velvet mask with a silver teardrop sewn beneath one eye. She would wear it in public, but speak to no one. It was a vow of fidelity and suffering, seen as both romantic and unsettling. People whispered about women who wore the mask for years, even decades, awaiting men who would never return. In some circles, the mask itself became a fetish object, and unscrupulous nobles would try to steal it as a trophy of conquest. These trends, of course, shifted constantly with the tides of power, piety, and politics. As the Inquisition spread, fashion that once signaled affection or playful courtship became grounds for accusation. A woman who wore too many ribbons might be accused of bewitching men. A man with a perfumed collar could be called effeminate or immoral. And so courtship was forced underground again, into more subtle gestures and more dangerous games. Yet for all this peril, the flame of romance endured. A glance across the hall, a whispered vow in a crowded chapel, a ribbon tied to a tree, these were the lifelines of lovers in a world that offered little privacy and less mercy. And through it all, clothing remained their canvas, their diary, their declaration. In the final part of our journey, we'll turn to the magical and superstitious side of medieval romance. Love potions brewed from frog tongues and moonwort, spells cast in graveyards at midnight, and rituals designed to bind souls for eternity, or at least until Michaelmas. Because if fashion couldn't win the heart, perhaps a little enchantment could. Stay with me, the weirdest is yet to come. If everything else failed, if your lute serenade fell flat, if your scented tunic stirred no hearts, and even your best glance across the banquet table returned nothing but a stifled yawn, then there was always magic. Or at least, the desperate hope of it. Love in the Middle Ages was risky. It could be dangerous, forbidden, or just plain inconvenient. And so, many turned to spells, charms, and potions to tilt fate in their favor. These weren't always the domain of witches or alchemists. Sometimes, it was your grandmother, your neighbor, or a curious apothecary assistant working behind closed shutters. In a world where science and superstition blurred together like ink on wet parchment, magic was both a last resort and a first instinct. The most common request? A love potion. In every region, there were whispered recipes, most of them disgusting. Some involved powdered animal bones, dried frog skin, ashes from a church candle, or even menstrual blood. One particularly popular English remedy called for mixing a piece of heart from a hare slain at midnight, 3 strands of the beloved's hair, and wine left under the moonlight for 1 full cycle. It had to be served in a pewter cup, warmed by the user's hands. Whether it worked is a matter of folklore, but what's certain is that people believed it could. The church officially condemned all love magic, calling it heretical and demonic. But that didn't stop clergy from reporting it regularly in confessionals. One 13th century priest in Milan described a woman who fed her husband a daily mixture of his own toenails, ground up and mixed with honey, to keep his affections from wandering. A German bishop wrote of a knight who carried a rabbit's heart in a pouch on his chest, anointed with oil of frankincense and murmured prayers stolen from a Byzantine spellbook. Among the most popular magical techniques was sympathetic magic, the belief that 2 things once connected could influence each other from afar. Lovers would exchange rings, lockets, even bits of clothing soaked in sweat or tears. One Flemish charm required a woman to sew a tiny doll from the cloth of her lover's shirt, whisper her desires into its ear, and bury it under a hawthorn tree. She was to return after 9 nights and check for signs. If the doll was damp, her love would soon visit. If it was dry and untouched, she was to forget him forever. Hair was particularly powerful. People believed that strands of hair carried the essence of the soul. Lockets containing a single strand were treasured and protected, but hair could also be used in curses. One 15th-century Parisian manuscript tells of a jilted woman who twisted her former lover's hair into a wax effigy, tied it with threads from his tunic, and burned it over a slow flame while chanting verses backwards. The man reportedly developed a mysterious fever, followed by impotence, followed by public humiliation, though that last part may have had more to do with his own personality than any spell. And then there was moonwort, a rare and eerie plant said to bloom only under a full moon, and only if gathered in silence. It was the centerpiece of many love charms. Moonwort steeped in red wine was said to make the drinker fall in love with the first person they saw. Moonwort sewn into a pillow could produce dreams of one's future spouse. And moonwort burned at midnight while whispering a name 3 times? That, they claimed, could summon a lover across any distance, provided no dog barked, no owl hooted, and no human voice broke the silence. Easy enough, right? In Slavic traditions, the binding spell was feared and respected. 2 lovers would walk a circle around a tree 7 times, each tying a red ribbon around the trunk. As they walked, they'd whisper promises of loyalty, sealed with a drop of wine or blood. Once bound, it was said, their fates were joined until death or betrayal. The tree became a secret shrine, visited once a year. If one person broke the pact, the other would suffer loss, of voice, of fortune, or of love entirely. Animal-based rituals were even stranger. In parts of medieval Spain, it was believed that placing a toad in a clay jar with rosemary and honey, burying it beneath a doorstep, and digging it up 30 days later would produce a stone in its stomach called a toad pearl. That pearl, worn on a chain, would supposedly make the wearer irresistible to the opposite sex. It probably just made people think you had very weird jewelry. Some rituals bordered on performance art. In southern Italy, girls would prepare a dream mirror, a small piece of polished metal placed in a bowl of spring water on St. Agnes Eve. After reciting a prayer, they'd sleep with the bowl beside their bed. If the water rippled at midnight, they'd dream of their future husband's face. If it remained still, they were fated to wait another year. Superstitious parents often dumped the water just before midnight, blaming restless spirits. Not all magic was meant to attract. Some was meant to keep others away. A woman in 14th century Denmark reportedly placed 9 grains of black salt in a circle around her bed every night to ward off suitors she didn't want. A man in Bohemia carved strange symbols into the doors of his home so that only women with pure hearts and good intentions could step inside. Did it work? It certainly kept the curious away. And then, of course, there were dreams. In medieval thought, dreams were not just psychological phenomena. They were messages, sometimes from God, sometimes from demons, sometimes from your own subconscious, which might as well be both. Dream manuals were incredibly popular. These thick, handwritten volumes offered elaborate interpretations. Dreaming of water meant longing. Dreaming of fire meant passion. Dreaming of birds? Depends on the bird. A dove meant loyalty. A crow? Infidelity. An owl? Lust and bad timing. People would manipulate their dreams in hopes of divine matchmaking. One common practice was to sleep with a bay leaf under your tongue and your shoes on the wrong feet. This was supposed to confuse your soul just enough to wander into the right vision. Another method required reciting a long, rhyming prayer about Saint Valentine while facing east, while holding a rose petal. If you forgot the last line, it was believed your love life would be cursed with awkward silences. In courts and castles, astrology was the elite's favorite love tool. Courtiers would consult stargazers before confessing feelings or arranging marriages. A well-timed flirtation under Venus and Libra might succeed where Mars and Scorpio would doom it. Some nobles even delayed weddings until planetary alignments improved. Entire affairs were plotted like siege campaigns, based not on affection or opportunity, but on Saturn's placement in the 7th house. And yet, despite all these tricks and rituals, love in the Middle Ages remained wildly unpredictable. 2 peasants might fall for each other over shared ale and laughter. 2 nobles might hate each other, then marry out of duty, then slowly grow tender. A knight might pine for a lady for years, writing sonnets no one would ever read. A washerwoman might glimpse a merchant once, blush, and never see him again. In the end, the strangest truth about medieval love wasn't the potions or the prayers. It was that, across a world lit by fire and ruled by fear, people still dared to feel it. They still whispered to the moon, carved initials into trees, and risked their reputations for one more glance, one more word, one more stolen touch. So next time you complain about dating apps, remember, at least you don't need powdered owl eyes, a rabbit's heart, and a silent night under a hawthorn tree just to get a second date. Love may be hard, but at least now, it's less likely to get you accused of witchcraft. Now, take a deep breath, let your eyes close, and drift gently into sleep with the thought that, no matter the century, no matter the rules, someone somewhere has always been willing to look foolish for love. Imagine being born a disappointment, declared illegitimate, imprisoned in a tower by your own sister, and then rising to become the most feared monarch in your country's history. Elizabeth I didn't just inherit a crown. She fought for it with silence, strategy, and steel. She was not meant to rule. Not truly. Not in the eyes of the men who sat on councils, who whispered in corridors, who saw kings as necessary and queens as unfortunate accidents. Elizabeth Tudor entered the world on September 7th, 1533, under a cloud of quiet disappointment. Her father, King Henry VIII, had broken England away from the Catholic Church just to marry her mother and Boleyn. The country had split apart. Monasteries fell. Blood was shed. And then, the long-awaited son didn't come. A daughter did. From the moment she was born, Elizabeth's existence was a political inconvenience. Her mother, and Boleyn, lasted barely 3 years before she was accused of adultery and executed. Elizabeth, not yet 3 years old, was declared illegitimate. She was stripped of her title, her place in the succession, and any sense of stability. She became Lady Elizabeth, not Princess. So how does a girl like that become the most feared ruler of England? The answer lies in how she learned to survive. Elizabeth grew up in a world where favor vanished overnight, where queens lost their heads, and where being too clever could cost your life. Her childhood was not filled with toys or laughter. It was filled with tutors and tension. Latin before breakfast, Greek before lunch, diplomacy before she was 10. Elizabeth learned to be cautious, watchful, strategic. She learned to measure her words like a lawyer, smile like a saint, and hide her thoughts like a thief. She learned to trust no one completely, not even her own family, especially not them. By the time her father died in 1547, Elizabeth was 13. Her younger half-brother Edward became king, but he was sickly. The men around him schemed, seeing the child king as a tool. Elizabeth kept her distance. She watched what happened to her cousin, Lady Jane Grey, crowned queen for 9 days, then executed. She watched her sister Mary ascend the throne next, burning Protestants as heretics and marrying a Spanish prince who made the country uneasy. Then Mary turned her suspicion toward Elizabeth. It's difficult to overstate the danger Elizabeth was in during those years. Mary saw her as a Protestant rival, a figurehead for rebellion. When a failed uprising broke out in 1554, Elizabeth was arrested and marched to the Tower of London, the same tower where her mother had been beheaded. The gates closed behind her. She was 20 years old. For 2 months, Elizabeth lived under the shadow of execution. Every day could have been her last. But she said nothing, admitted nothing, pleaded nothing. She simply waited and survived. That silence became her most powerful weapon. Elizabeth realized something critical. The less you say, the less they can use against you. When she was released, she returned to the countryside, watched her words, and never made a move without thinking 10 steps ahead. In 1558, Mary died. Childless, unloved, untrusted, and in a sudden shift of fate, Elizabeth, the bastard daughter of a disgraced queen, became Queen of England. She was 25 years old, and England was a mess. Religious division tore at the nation. Catholics wanted the old ways back. Protestants pushed for reform. Foreign powers, France, Spain, the Pope himself, watched, waiting for weakness. The treasury was nearly empty. The navy was in shambles. No one knew what to expect from this young woman in a stiff white ruff and cautious smile. But Elizabeth knew exactly what she was going to do. She didn't marry. That was her first and most radical decision. Everyone expected her to take a husband immediately, ideally a prince who could bring alliances and armies. But Elizabeth refused. She understood the game better than anyone. Marriage meant sharing power. It meant giving her throne to someone else's agenda. It meant risk. And Elizabeth had survived too much to hand over control now. She played suitors against each other like chess pieces. Spanish princes, French dukes, even her old friend Robert Dudley. She dangled possibility without promise, courted without committing. Each time, she gave her counsel hope, let foreign ambassadors gossip, and then withdrew. Over and over. For years. And so she kept everyone guessing. If you didn't know who the queen would marry, you couldn't predict where her alliances would land. Elizabeth weaponized uncertainty. Her personal life became national policy. But she didn't only manipulate hearts. She controlled her image like a modern PR mastermind. Elizabeth knew how to use theater. Her clothes, her speeches, her portraits, they were all calculated. She painted herself as the Virgin Queen, married only to England. She wore gowns embroidered with eyes and ears, symbols of her watchfulness. She stood before crowds glowing in gold and crimson, radiating divine right. She gave fiery speeches that rallied troops and terrified opponents. One of her most iconic declarations came decades later, when England faced the threat of Spanish invasion. Standing in armor before her army at Tilbury, she declared, "I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king." It sent a message that echoed through the continent. This queen was no pawn. But power came at a price. Elizabeth didn't hesitate to silence threats, real or perceived. Her reign saw the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, her own cousin, whose Catholic supporters plotted against the crown for decades. It was a controversial decision. Mary was a queen by birth, but she was also a symbol for rebellion. Elizabeth hesitated for years. Signing the death warrant was an agony, but she knew what was at stake. In the end, she signed it and never looked back. Her spies, led by Sir Francis Walsingham, formed one of the most advanced intelligence networks in Europe. They intercepted letters, cracked codes, foiled assassination plots. Elizabeth turned information into survival. In many ways, she ruled through knowledge more than force. Her enemies never quite knew what she knew, or what she'd do next. England began to change. Slowly, steadily. She strengthened the navy, encouraged exploration, funded pirate captains turned privateers like Francis Drake, who raided Spanish treasure fleets and returned with gold. She invested in culture, Shakespeare, Marlowe, music, printing, theater. The Elizabethan era flourished not just because of military strength, but because the country found a strange new confidence. Still, not everyone feared her because of war. They feared her because they couldn't outmaneuver her. Foreign ambassadors wrote home in frustration. "She is a woman," one grumbled, "but she thinks like a fox and rules like a lion." They couldn't predict her, couldn't seduce her, couldn't trap her with treaties. She rewrote the expectations for what a monarch, especially a female monarch, could be. Elizabeth I didn't reign by brute strength. She reigned through calculated charisma, ruthless intelligence, and political patience unlike anything England had seen. By the time she was 40, she had outlived rivals, avoided assassins, and turned England from a vulnerable outpost into a rising power. And yet, she still had decades to go, and the storms ahead would test her like never before. The throne had been secured, the conspiracies thwarted. The crown, for the moment, rested firmly on Elizabeth's head. But being queen was not the end of the game. It was the beginning of a new, higher-stakes one. Ruling England meant ruling a house divided. Religious tensions that had ignited under Henry VIII and flared under Mary I were now smoldering under Elizabeth, threatening to explode at any moment. On paper, Elizabeth was Protestant, but she walked a dangerously fine line. Too much leniency, and the Protestant reformers would accuse her of betrayal. Too much severity, and the Catholics would rise again. Her solution? Ambiguity. Brilliant, maddening ambiguity. The Elizabethan religious settlement of 1559 was a masterstroke of careful compromise. It reinstated the Book of Common Prayer, but softened its language to be less offensive to Catholics. It acknowledged the monarch as supreme governor of the Church of England, a clever workaround for those uncomfortable with a woman being supreme head. Church attendance was mandatory, but enforcement was selective. Elizabeth enforced unity not with fire, like her sister Mary, but with masks. Everyone was expected to participate in the national religion, but quietly. Private belief? That was your own business, as long as it didn't threaten the state. It was a system built on silent compliance, not forced conversion. But silence couldn't hold forever. Across the Channel, Catholic Europe seethed. The Pope excommunicated Elizabeth in 1570, calling on English Catholics to rise up and depose her. It was a declaration of spiritual war, and it gave birth to plots, dozens of them, over the next 2 decades. Assassins were smuggled in. Secret masses were held. Letters were encrypted. Daggers were drawn in the dark. And still, Elizabeth survived. Her weapon now was not a sword or an army, but an invisible force that spread across England like a web. The Elizabethan spy network. Sir Francis Walsingham, her spymaster, was the architect of this silent empire. He created a surveillance state in all but name, one that intercepted letters, paid informants, and sniffed out treason before it could bloom. Priests were captured, codes were broken, and secret printing presses destroyed. The state knew what you whispered, sometimes before you did. One of the most famous plots, the Babington Plot, revealed the full extent of this machinery. In 1586, a young Catholic nobleman named Anthony Babington conspired to assassinate Elizabeth and place her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, on the throne. It seemed airtight, encrypted messages, secret symbols, hidden correspondence. But every letter Babington wrote had already been intercepted. Walsingham's agents had decoded every word. They waited, letting the plot unfold just enough to ensnare everyone involved. And then, they pounced. Babington was arrested and executed. But the prize wasn't him. The prize was Mary. For decades, Mary Stuart had been a thorn in Elizabeth's side, a rival queen with a strong claim, a Catholic figurehead, and a magnet for rebellion. Elizabeth had kept her alive, imprisoned in various castles, partly out of family loyalty, partly because executing another queen was a dangerous precedent. But now, she had proof. Mary had endorsed the plot. In writing, the death warrant was signed. On February 8, 1587, Mary was executed. The world was shocked. A queen had killed a queen. But Elizabeth, though visibly distressed, did not flinch. That's when the fear began to settle in, deep and real. This woman, this unmarried, childless queen, could and would eliminate threats when necessary. With one signature, she had silenced the Catholic claim and sent a message across Europe: I will not be replaced. The timing could not have been more fateful, because 1 year later, Spain came for her. The Spanish Armada wasn't just a war. It was a thunderous declaration that Catholic Europe was done tolerating Elizabeth's existence. King Philip II of Spain, widower of Elizabeth's sister Mary, now declared himself the rightful king of England. With the Pope's blessing, he amassed one of the largest fleets the world had seen. 130 ships, 8,000 sailors, 19,000 soldiers. Their mission: to invade England, depose Elizabeth, and restore Catholic rule. It was the ultimate test of Elizabeth's reign and her reputation. She didn't hide. She didn't weep. She didn't panic. Instead, she rode out to Tilbury, dressed not as a queen of silks and lace, but in steel armor. Before an army of thousands, she gave one of the most famous speeches in English history. I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, she declared, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England, too. Those words changed everything. The speech didn't just rally troops. It transformed Elizabeth from a cautious politician into a myth. She became something larger than life, a monarch of iron will, a national symbol of defiance. Her enemies didn't just fear her politics. They feared her presence, and fate seemed to favor her. The Spanish Armada met with disastrous weather, poor coordination, and fierce resistance. English fire ships scattered their formation. Storms wrecked their return journey. More than half the fleet was lost. Elizabeth's navy didn't just defend the realm. They humiliated the most powerful empire in the world. It was the high point of her reign, a moment of absolute dominance. From that day, England was no longer a timid kingdom scrambling to survive. It was a rising power with a queen who had defeated Rome, Spain, and the tides themselves. And still, she did not rest. Because Elizabeth knew something critical: fear fades. Victory is fleeting. What lingers is image. She doubled down on propaganda. Paintings depicted her as the eternal queen, cloaked in stars, pearls, and symbols of empire. In the famous Armada portrait, she stands before a map, hand resting on a globe, ships sailing triumphantly in the background. Her face is calm. Her crown glows. Behind her, windows show storm-wrecked Spanish galleons. This wasn't a portrait. It was a warning. Do not come for me. But not all challenges came from abroad. At home, the passage of time brought new uncertainties. Elizabeth was aging. She had no heir, no husband, no clear successor. Parliament begged her to marry, to secure the dynasty. But she refused. Every year that passed without an heir increased anxiety. Who would rule after her? Would the kingdom collapse in a civil war? Would Catholic or Protestant factions seize control? Elizabeth gave no answers, only smiles. Some say this made her reckless. Others say it made her invincible. The truth is more complicated. Elizabeth's refusal to marry gave her unmatched freedom, but it also meant she carried the entire future of England on her shoulders. Every decision had to be perfect, every appearance flawless, every slip a potential catastrophe. And so she grew more private, more guarded, more alone. Her inner circle narrowed. Robert Dudley, her lifelong friend and rumored lover, died. Her cousin Mary was gone. Her advisors aged and passed away. The court changed. Younger nobles, impatient, ambitious, began to chafe under her control. Chief among them was Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. Handsome, daring, theatrical, he was everything Elizabeth once admired in a courtier. But he lacked Dudley's discipline. He overstepped, disobeyed, failed in battle, and finally rebelled. In 1601, Essex led a short, foolish uprising against the Queen. It failed. He was captured, tried, executed, and with that, Elizabeth sent her final message to those who thought she was growing weak. Challenge me, and you die, no matter how close you once were. She had survived conspiracies, assassination attempts, civil unrest, the Pope's fury, and the most powerful navy in Europe. But now, in her later years, Elizabeth I faced an enemy she could not outwit, arrest, or outlast: time. By the dawn of the 17th century, the Queen who had once been hailed as England's radiant hope, the Virgin Queen, Gloriana, the English Deborah, was in her late 60s. For the standards of the time, that was remarkable. Few monarchs had lived so long, let alone ruled so effectively for so many decades. And yet, the twilight of her reign was perhaps the most revealing. It was in these years that Elizabeth's rule turned from sheer power to sheer presence. She didn't need to conquer anymore. Her existence alone was a form of dominance. But make no mistake, her grip on power was still iron. Her fearsome reputation was not born from cruelty, but from control over her court, her image, her narrative, and even her memory. By now, Elizabeth had perfected the art of mystique. She rarely appeared in public without elaborate gowns, towering wigs, and thick layers of white makeup, a mask of immortality. Her face became a canvas of national myth, ageless, unreadable, flawless. In a world where monarchs were symbols, she transformed herself into a living icon, and she made sure everyone around her played their part. Courtiers were expected to flatter, poets to praise, painters to idealize. Elizabethan England wasn't just a court, it was a stage, and the Queen was both director and star. Even the culture of the time bent to her will. Shakespeare's plays were staged in her honor. Edmund Spenser dedicated his epic The Faerie Queene to her. Music, poetry, and theater flourished, but they all knew the price of royal favor: unwavering loyalty and reverence. It was Elizabeth who turned propaganda into an art form. She didn't need a modern press machine. She had portraits. She had pageants. She had whispers. She understood that ruling people's hearts was far more effective than ruling by force. But this control came at a cost. Privately, Elizabeth aged painfully. She suffered from toothaches, arthritis, and deep fatigue. She lost her appetite. Her once proud red hair thinned to gray and was replaced by wigs. Her eyesight faded. Her most trusted advisors, Burleigh, Leicester, Walsingham, died one by one, and the new generation never quite earned her trust. The loneliness was profound. She had built a court where no one dared speak the full truth. She had constructed a myth so powerful that even her closest companions were afraid to remind her that she was mortal. And yet, she endured. Despite health issues and political pressures, she remained sharp, witty, and impossible to predict. Diplomats dreaded their interviews with her. She could flay a foreign ambassador with a single line and smile while doing it. Still, the question loomed larger each year. Who would succeed her? Elizabeth refused to name an heir. Perhaps out of caution, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of pride. To name a successor was to admit the end was near, and Gloriana did not acknowledge endings. This uncertainty fueled endless anxiety. England had no precedent for a peaceful, undisputed transfer of power. The Wars of the Roses were still fresh in the national memory. If Elizabeth died without naming a successor, the country could spiral into chaos. The most likely candidate was James VI of Scotland, son of her executed cousin Mary. He was Protestant, politically savvy, and eager to inherit the throne. But Elizabeth never publicly endorsed him. Instead, she ruled. Her court was still full of rituals, dances, and declarations of eternal youth. But behind the scenes, the country was shifting. A younger generation, restless, ambitious, and eager for the next chapter, grew tired of Elizabeth's theatrical style. They called her out of touch, too cautious, too obsessed with symbols. But they misunderstood her entirely. Caution had kept her alive. Caution had kept England stable. Every decision she made was filtered through survival, not just her own, but the nation's. She had seen how quickly kings and queens could fall. Her father had ruled by fear. Her siblings had ruled by blood. Elizabeth ruled by legend. And by now, her legend was untouchable. Even foreign enemies treated her with a strange mix of fear and fascination. She had outlasted the Pope's decrees, Spain's invasion, the constant threat of domestic uprisings. She had become a fixed star in a sky that others merely passed through. By 1603, her strength was failing. She became reclusive, spending long hours in darkened chambers, dressed all in black. Her court noted her silence, her exhaustion, her increasingly fragile frame. She had lost the power to dazzle, but never the power to rule. Even as she approached death, her dignity remained intact. When courtiers asked who should follow her, she reportedly whispered the name James, a subtle end to a lifelong game of ambiguity. On March 24, 1603, Queen Elizabeth I died. She had ruled for 44 years. The Virgin Queen was gone, but her legacy had only begun. Elizabeth did not leave behind children. She did not leave behind a dynasty. What she left was something far more durable, a myth. She became England itself. Her reign was remembered not just as an era of prosperity, but of defiance, of brilliance, of a woman who had stared down kings, popes, assassins, and time, and never blinked. For centuries, she would be romanticized, debated, idolized, and feared. Her name would become a benchmark for greatness, her portrait a symbol of strength, her words quoted in times of war and uncertainty. She had ruled as a woman in a world of men, and had not only survived but triumphed. To fear her was not weakness. It was history's way of remembering power. They buried her in Westminster Abbey, beneath the grand stone arches of England's memory. Her coffin was placed atop that of her half-sister, Mary I, the queen who had once imprisoned her, whose reign had tried to undo Protestant England. Now they lay together, in silence. The inscription above them read, "Partners in throne and grave, here rest two sisters." But even in death, Elizabeth I refused to be anyone's equal. History would remember only one of them as Gloriana. The Elizabethan age was over, but the aftershocks of her reign would stretch on for centuries. She had ruled longer than any monarch in English history to that point, and in doing so, she had redrawn the very idea of monarchy. She wasn't just queen by birth. She was queen by will, strategy, and sheer audacity. And that terrified people, not because she was cruel. She wasn't a tyrant. She didn't line the streets with heads on pikes or lead armies into brutal wars of conquest. No, what made Elizabeth truly feared was her mastery of control. Control of her image. Control of her court. Control of history itself. She turned a throne under siege into a symbol of national power. She took a kingdom that was divided, weakened, and uncertain, and she made it into a rising empire. Under Elizabeth, England found its voice, its identity, its purpose, and yet, she did this without a husband, without children, and often, without clear heirs. In a world where women were supposed to marry and bear sons to secure peace, Elizabeth offered something else: stability through solitude, sovereignty through self. She made her body a symbol of the realm. Her virginity was not just personal, it became political. The Virgin Queen wasn't just a poetic title, it was a strategy, a shield, a weapon. She could not be married off. used, manipulated. No foreign king would claim England through her. She belonged only to her country. That made her unpredictable. It also made her untouchable. Foreign powers never knew what to expect. Suitors came and went. Ambassadors wrote home in frustration, trying to decipher her intentions. She flirted with kings, but never surrendered. She promised everything and gave nothing. It wasn't coyness, it was command. But Elizabeth's reign wasn't just a triumph of personality. It was a crucible of policy and diplomacy. She kept England Protestant without plunging it into the kind of brutal religious wars that tore apart Europe. She funded exploration without bankrupting her people. She punished rebellion firmly, but selectively. And when the Spanish Armada threatened her shores, she did not hide behind palace walls. She rode out in armor. She gave speeches to her troops that still echo through the centuries. "I know I have the body of a weak, feeble woman," she said, "but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." That was not just rhetoric. It was the foundation of a myth, one that lives on. Even after her death, her image endured. Painters continued to depict her in glowing white robes, adorned with pearls and symbols of empire. Writers compared her to goddesses, warriors, and saints. And monarchs who followed, men and women alike, found themselves judged against her standard. Was Elizabeth perfect? Of course not. Her reign had flaws, cracks, and contradictions. Poverty persisted in parts of England. Ireland suffered under English rule and rebellion. Her court could be treacherous, her punishment severe. But history doesn't remember perfection. It remembers presence. And Elizabeth was everywhere. She left no heir, yet her successors ruled in her shadow. James I may have unified the crowns of England and Scotland, but he lacked her magnetism. Charles I lost his head trying to reassert royal power in a way she never had to. Even centuries later, monarchs looked back to Elizabeth not just as a predecessor, but as a blueprint. A ruler who governed with sharpness, spectacle, and an almost supernatural grip on narrative. She wasn't just England's queen. She was England's idea of itself. That's why she was feared. Because Elizabeth I made the crown seem both divine and human. She walked the razor's edge between vulnerability and majesty. Her people loved her, but they also dreaded her disfavor. Courtiers lived or died on the curve of her eyebrow. Foreign leaders calculated their moves based on the flick of her fan or the words she didn't say. She could stall an alliance with silence. She could crush a rebellion with a single proclamation. She didn't need swords to wound. She had policy and poise. In that sense, she was the ultimate ruler, not by force, but by finesse. Her legacy is not one of brutality, but of brilliance. That's what makes her story so lasting. Not the bloodshed or the wars, but the intellect, the art of presence, the power of being feared for your mind, your cunning, your restraint. Elizabeth I's England became a place where ideas blossomed, drama flourished, and the seeds of empire took root. Her sailors crossed oceans. Her poets reinvented language. Her spies changed the way states conducted shadow wars. She had forged something uniquely English, a monarchy tempered with theatricality, politics softened by spectacle, sovereignty bound to myth. And when you look at England today, its institutions, its traditions, its sense of national self, you still see her fingerprints. You see her in the way monarchs speak with care and ceremony. You see her in the obsession with legacy, with lineage, with national pageantry. You see her in the way England tells its own story, as plucky, powerful, and impossibly poised. That wasn't an accident. That was Elizabeth. She ruled alone, not because she had no other options, but because she chose to. She died childless, but with generations in her debt. She was feared, not for cruelty, but for brilliance. And that, in the end, may be the rarest power of all. They said she rode like thunder and cut like lightning. A warrior in a world that told women to wait at home. When the clans of Japan tore the land apart in the Genpei War, she rode into history, helmet gleaming, bow strung, sword unsheathed. This isn't a myth. This is the life of Tomoguzen. And it begins not with glory, but with fire. Kyoto burned. By the late 12th century, Japan was fractured. The imperial court had become little more than a gilded cage, beautiful but powerless. Real authority was shifting into the hands of military clans, warriors who held the sword, controlled the provinces, and now wanted the throne. Two names stood above all: the Minamoto, and the Taira. These families had once served the emperor, but now they served only ambition. And when that ambition boiled over, it didn't happen in back rooms or whispered councils. It happened with cavalry charges, river battles, and burning cities. It happened in blood. And in that chaos, amid warriors who had trained since childhood, among men armored like beasts and wielding bows taller than their own bodies, there appeared someone no one expected. A woman. Tomo Guzan. Even her name was unusual. Guzan was not a surname. It was an honorific, meaning lady. It was how you addressed noblewomen, courtesans, empresses, not samurai. No one quite agrees where she was born. Some say in Echigo, the snowy northern provinces. Others claim the Central Plains. Even the chronicles of her life blur between legend and reality. But one thing they all agree on, she fought. She fought better than most men. We first meet her in the Heike Monogatari, an epic chronicle written in the early 13th century. It's part history, part poetry, part political commentary, a grand tale meant to explain the rise and fall of great clans. And somewhere among the tales of generals and monks and doomed emperors, there is a passage that simply refuses to fade. It reads, Tomo was especially beautiful, with white skin, long hair, and charming features. She was also a remarkably strong archer, and as a swordswoman she was a warrior worth 1,000, ready to confront a demon or a god, mounted or on foot. She handled unbroken horses with superb skill. She rode and scathed down perilous descents. Whenever a battle was imminent, Yashinaka sent her out as his first captain, equipped with strong armor, an oversized sword, and a mighty bow. She performed more deeds of valor than any of his other warriors. That passage would make her famous for 800 years, but in the late 1100s, it made her dangerous. Tomo Guzan served Minamoto no Yashinaka, a general, a cousin to the future shogun, and a deeply ambitious man. Yashinaka had risen in rebellion against the Taira, claiming he wanted to restore the emperor's rule. In truth, he wanted the capital. Tomo became his trusted commander, and more than that, his weapon. When Yashinaka needed a decisive strike, he sent Tomo. She led cavalry raids. She charged enemy lines. She terrified trained men, not just by her skill, but by the fact that she dared to be there at all. Every sword she broke, every helmet she split, every man she unhorsed, it was more than victory. It was heresy. Japan in the 12th century had no shortage of violence, but it had very strict rules about who was allowed to commit it. Samurai were men. Women were background. Wives. Sisters. Sometimes messengers or political hostages, but never warriors. Except Tomo didn't ask for permission. She arrived with a bow taller than herself and a quiver full of consequences. And as Yashinaka's star rose, so did hers. Together, they pushed deep into enemy territory. They fought in snow-covered valleys and rain-choked plains. They scattered the Taira at the Battle of Yokodagawara. They stormed the capital and seized Kyoto itself. It seemed, for a moment, that Tomo had done the impossible. She was a woman who had taken a seat at the table of generals and cleared it with a sword. But glory is slippery, and in the court politics of medieval Japan, loyalty had a very short shelf life. Yashinaka's cousin, Minamoto no Yuritamo, was rising fast. He was colder, more calculating, and he had no use for glory-seeking relatives. When Yashinaka captured Kyoto, Yuritamo didn't celebrate. He accused him of arrogance, of rebellion. And soon, the same family name that had united them became a war cry. The Genpei War wasn't just Minamoto versus Taira anymore. It was Minamoto versus Minamoto. Tomo found herself no longer leading charges against a common enemy, but standing between two factions of the same clan, each claiming to be the future of Japan. And here, her story turns. In early 1184, Yashinaka and Tomo found themselves cornered by the forces of Yuritamo, led by two other cousins, Noriyori and Yoshitsune. Their army was outnumbered. The fields near the Uji River, just outside Kyoto, would become their grave. This was the Battle of Awazu. It was snowing. The riverbanks were slick with ice. Yashinaka had only a few hundred men left, Tomo among them. And according to the legends, she fought like a demon. She shattered armor. She crushed skulls. One story says she rode up to a famous warrior named Onda no Hachiro, grabbed him by the neck, dragged him from his saddle, and decapitated him right there. That was her final act in the chronicles, because what happened next is unclear. Some say Yashinaka, seeing defeat ahead, ordered Tomo to flee, that he didn't want to die alongside a woman, that her death would shame him. Others say she refused and rode with him to the end. Still others whisper she survived, that she shaved her head, became a nun, and lived out her days in silence. There are even folk tales that she married the very warrior who killed her lord and lived out her days not as a widow, but a wife. The histories fall silent, but the image remains. A woman on a war horse, bloody but unbroken, bow in one hand, sword in the other, riding into the snow. Snow fell in thick silence, as if the heavens themselves wished to muffle what was happening on the ground. The Battle of Awaza marked the end of Minamoto no Yashinaka's campaign, but it immortalized Tomoguzen. She stood on a narrow plain near the Uji River, the cold biting through her armor, her horse's breath rising in clouds. Around her, the final moments of her lord's rebellion played out in crimson arcs and muffled screams. And still, she fought. We do not know the exact count. The records only say she cut down enemies as though they were reeds. Perhaps it was 5, perhaps 15, perhaps more. But what's clear is that in those last minutes, she carved her place into legend. And then as she vanished, what followed was silence. No letters, no commands, no final charge. Just the snow and the knowledge that her lord, Yashinaka, was slain. There are several theories about what happened next. One holds that she was ordered to flee to preserve the honor of the Minamoto name. As the story goes, Yashinaka didn't want a woman to die beside him, even one who'd led his armies. So he told her, "Go." In that version, she obeyed, vanishing into the wilderness. But obedience had never been Tomoguzen's nature. Other tales say she disobeyed, that she charged into battle and was never seen again, her fate swallowed by war. And then there are those who believe she lived. They say she turned her back on the sword. She cut her hair, once long and glossy, now a sign of her renunciation, and became a nun in a mountain temple where she prayed for the souls of the fallen. The warrior who once brought men to their knees now knelt in silent devotion. But it's the next version, the most human, and perhaps the strangest, that endures in Japanese folklore. It says she was captured, taken by Wada Yashimori, a general loyal to the rising Minamoto no Yuritamo. Impressed by her valor, or perhaps intrigued by her very existence, he didn't kill her. Instead, he married her. That story claims she bore him a son, Asahina Yoshihide, who would grow into a warrior in his own right, famed for his strength. In this version, Tomo becomes not just a legend, but a mother, a matriarch of warriors. Whether the tale is true or not, we may never know. But what it tells us is this. Tomoguzen refused to disappear. Even when history tried to write her off the page, she kept reappearing in temples, in battle songs, in whispered rumors passed down through the centuries. Because something about her refused to stay dead. Japan, in the decades after the Jinpei War, was no kinder to women than before. In fact, it became worse. The shogunate that Minamoto no Yuritamo founded, the first in Japanese history, was a system built on militarized patriarchy. Women lost what little land rights they had. They were stripped of political influence. Their role was to birth warriors, not to be one. Tomoguzen's life became an uncomfortable contradiction, a walking impossibility. But that didn't stop people from telling her story. In the 13th and 14th centuries, traveling monks and biwa-hoshi, blind Luke priests, began to perform the Hikomonogatari in towns and villages across Japan. As they chanted the rise and fall of the Tara and Minamoto clans, audiences would perk up when they reached the tale of a woman warrior. The reactions were mixed. Some were inspired, others offended. In samurai households, fathers warned daughters not to get ideas. In rural inns, old men claimed they'd seen her once on a misty road, dressed in white, her bow slung behind her. And as generations passed, her story grew taller. One tale described her defeating 10 warriors at once using only a naginata and her wits. Another said she could ride full gallop, draw her bow, and pierce a coin from 100 paces. A more supernatural version insisted she had been protected by the spirits of foxes, that her very presence on the battlefield was a kind of magic. Of course, history is rarely so generous. The truth is likely less mythic and more remarkable. Tomoguzen was not the only woman to fight in Japanese history, but she is the first whose name we remember. And the reason we remember her is not just her skill with weapons, but her defiance of structure. She entered a man's world, wore his armor, and won his battles on her own terms. And she did it during the Jinpei War, which wasn't just a feud between two clans. It was the violent birth of a new Japan. When Minamoto no Yuritamo emerged victorious, he did not restore power to the emperor. He created the shogunate, a military dictatorship in all but name. The emperor remained, but only as a symbolic figurehead. The true power lay in Kamakura in the hands of the shogun. Tomoguzin's surviving years, if she lived them, would have been spent in this new world. A world she helped create, yet was unlikely to belong in. And yet her legend endured. During the Edo period, 1603 to 1868, centuries after her time, kabuki plays began featuring her as a tragic heroine. In some, she's a ghost, haunting the battlefield she once ruled. In others, she's a loyal lover, torn between duty and love. Sometimes she is a violent spirit of vengeance, sometimes a noble example of grace. Always, she is strong. Always, she is dangerous. By the 19th century, her name had become synonymous with a single image, the female samurai. Beautiful, deadly, unyielding. Artists painted her. Writers romanticized her. She became a symbol in a culture increasingly obsessed with the ideals of Bushido, the way of the warrior. And then came the 20th century. In the era of global wars, women in Japan were again discouraged from holding power. But schoolgirls still read about Tomo, and feminist scholars began to reclaim her, not as a fantasy, but as a precedent. Here was proof. They argued that the samurai code had room for women, that the way of the sword had once been for someone who dared to pick it up. Even today, her name lives on. In anime, in video games, in poetry and politics, in martial arts dojos, where her image is still used to inspire focus and fearlessness. But perhaps the most lasting place she remains is in the imagination. Because Tomoguzen challenges something deep in the heart of tradition. She asks, who writes the rules of history? And who gets to break them? When you strip away the armor, the banners, the horseback charges, Tomoguzen's story becomes about something even more enduring. Power. Not just the kind forged in steel or claimed in battle, but the power to exist, to persist, in a world that tries to make you invisible. In 12th century Japan, visibility was a weapon and a curse. To be seen was to be judged. To be different was to be punished. And for a woman to wield a sword, to lead men into battle, to ride at the front of a charge was to invite contradiction. Samurai culture was deeply hierarchical, not just by class and rank, but by gender. And though we now think of the warrior code, Bushido, as a rigid set of honor-bound principles, in Tomo's time it was still forming, still fluid. In that liminal space, she existed as both an anomaly and an architect. Let's rewind. The Genpei War wasn't simply a backdrop for her story. It was a stage of transformation for all of Japan. The fall of the Taira, the rise of the Minamoto, and the shift from imperial rule to military governance marked the beginning of a new epoch, the Kamakura period. And in this upheaval, Tomoguzen carved out a role that had no precedent. What made her stand out wasn't only her skill with weapons. There were other Onibugeisha, female warriors, from earlier centuries, especially among the noble families defending their lands during civil wars. But Tomo did what none of them did. She stepped into the spotlight. She didn't just defend a home. She led charges. She didn't fight in defense. She went on the offensive. She didn't vanish quietly. She was written into the Heike, the great war epic of her time, not as a supporting character, not as a martyr, not even as a love interest, but as a force of war. Here's how the Heike describes her. Tomo was especially beautiful, with white skin, long hair, and charming features. She was also a remarkably strong archer, and as a swordswoman she was a warrior worth 1,000, ready to confront a demon or a god, mounted or on foot. A warrior worth 1,000. In a literary tradition that often reduced women to poetic footnotes, that line stands out. It means something. It means her story wasn't just exceptional, it was undeniable. And yet, as the centuries passed, society tried to deny her anyway. In the early Kamakura period, after the Genpei War, the new shogunate made very clear decisions about who had power and who didn't. Samurai women were discouraged from traveling. They couldn't inherit large estates. Marriages became more transactional, more strategic. Their voices faded from official records. And still, Tomo's name echoed. In temples, in song, on painted scrolls passed from hand to hand. There's something remarkable about that. About a woman who, even when erased from politics, managed to stay in the culture. Her image evolved over time. In the No theater of the 14th and 15th centuries, Tomo was portrayed less as a warrior and more as a spirit, a ghost bound to the world by grief or honor. Her battles were reframed as metaphors. Her sword became a symbol of regret, not resistance. It was beautiful, it was tragic, and it was sanitized. But the kabuki theater, which emerged in the 17th century, gave her a different stage. Here, she returned with fire. Kabuki portrayed Tomoe as dramatic, impulsive, sometimes vengeful, always larger than life. She fought men and monsters. She wept for fallen comrades. She tore through scrolls of fate like they were paper banners. Audiences were captivated. Here was a woman who defied expectation, who could be fierce without losing grace, who could be loyal without being subservient. And in a country grappling with its own identity, torn between Confucian obedience and warrior independence, Tomoe became the perfect contradiction. She became a mirror. Different eras saw what they needed in her. The Edo period, obsessed with order and ritual, admired her discipline. The Meiji period, focused on modernization, emphasized her strength and adaptability. The militarists of the early 20th century saw in her a model of sacrifice. Feminist thinkers of the post-war period reclaimed her as a pioneer. And each generation reshaped the myth. In woodblock prints from the 1800s, Tomoe is often depicted mid-strike, hair flowing, armor glinting, her eyes locked on some unseen enemy. In modern manga, she becomes sleek and stylized, a fusion of the ancient and the futuristic. In video games, she's an avatar of vengeance, a hero for hire. But the through line remains. A woman who refused to vanish. And that matters. Because in history, as in war, survival isn't just about who has the sharpest blade. It's about who gets remembered. Tomoe's survival was cultural. Even if she died on the battlefield of Owazu, even if she lived in obscurity, even if she was forced into marriage, or faded into a temple, or disappeared into the mist, her story lived. And in a way, it was always about more than war. Tomoe embodies the question that haunts every rigid society. What do you do with someone who doesn't fit the mold? Do you exile her? Romanticize her? Rewrite her? Or do you let her remain what she was? In Japan's case, the answer was all of the above. There's an uneasiness in how her story's been preserved. A nervous reverence. As if keeping her alive in legend is safer than admitting what she meant in life. Because Tomoe did something quietly revolutionary. She proved that the code of the warrior could bend. She showed that courage didn't have to wear a beard. That discipline, loyalty, and honor weren't gender traits. That when battle called, the sword didn't care who held it, only how well it was used. And perhaps that's what frightened people most. Not just that she fought, but that she fought well. That she won. When we talk about Tomoe today, we're not just talking about history. We're talking about persistence. About how stories survive long after the world they came from is gone. About how myth becomes muscle memory, etched into the way a culture sees itself, its values, and its heroes. Tomoe, the warrior of the Genpei War, lived over 800 years ago. But in many ways, she feels closer now than ever. In modern Japan, her image appears in schools, museums, and popular media. Statues stand in places she may or may not have visited. Small shrines claim her as their protector. Historical dramas put her in shining armor, riding down enemies, always composed, always fierce. She's become more than a historical figure. She's become a symbol. And symbols are powerful. They're how cultures speak to themselves. They're how we pass on ideas, quietly, across generations. So what idea does Tomoe carry? It depends on who you ask. To historians, she represents the untold stories of women in feudal Japan, those whose contributions were buried beneath centuries of male-centered chronicles. To artists and writers, she's a blank canvas, mysterious, dramatic, a character who can be reshaped to reflect any era's obsessions. To feminists, she's a trailblazer. A reminder that the fight for equality doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it wears armor. And to school children, she's something else entirely, a heroine. A reminder that courage isn't limited by gender. But let's be honest, her story's been stretched and smoothed and mythologized so many times, it's hard to know what's real. Did she truly kill dozens of enemies in battle? Maybe. Did she actually decapitate a famous general with a single strike? Possibly. Did she disappear into a temple, cut her hair, and live out her life in silence? Could be. Or maybe she rode off into the mountains, never to be seen again, sword still sharp, heart still heavy. No one knows. But here's what we do know. Tomoe matters not because every detail of her story is true, but because her story was told at all. In a world that erased so many women, she remained. And that act of being remembered is revolutionary in itself. Because history, let's face it, hasn't been kind to women in armor. In most societies, the narrative goes like this. Men go to war. Women wait. Men fight. Women mourn. Men build empires. Women hold the household. But Tomoe interrupts that rhythm. She doesn't wait. She rides. She doesn't mourn. She strikes. She doesn't serve quietly. She leads loudly. And she forces us to ask, how many others were like her? How many stories never made it into scrolls and epics? How many women held swords, wore armor, gave orders, and were buried not just in graves, but in silence? Tomo-guzan didn't just fight a war. She fought erasure. And she won. Her image continues to evolve. In anime, she's been reimagined as everything from a tragic anti-heroine to a cybernetic warrior in futuristic armor. In video games, she shows up as a playable character, often with lightning-fast sword skills and that signature long black hair tied in a warrior's knot. In manga, she's drawn with fiery eyes, blood-streaked cheeks, always mid-battle, always just one strike away from changing everything. But beyond entertainment, her story inspires real people. Japanese martial arts schools often tell her tale to young female students, not just as folklore, but as encouragement. Swordsmanship isn't just for men. Strength isn't just about brawn. It's about will, focus, honor, values Tomo embodied. And she's not just a local icon anymore. Across the world, in classrooms, on podcasts, and documentaries, people are rediscovering her legend. Artists in the West paint her into murals. Cosplayists recreate her armor. Writers draw on her life to craft strong female protagonists. She's become a global symbol of resistance, of resilience. Because the truth is, you don't have to know every detail of her life to understand her impact. You just have to know this. In a time when women were told to stay silent, Tomo-guzan shouted. With her sword, with her deeds, with her refusal to stay in the background. And in doing so, she cut a path not just through enemy lines, but through history itself. That's why she matters. Not just as a warrior, but as a contradiction. Not just as a legend, but as a legacy. And maybe that's the most powerful thing about her. She shows us that history isn't fixed. It's alive. It breathes. It grows. It hides and reveals. It changes depending on who tells it, who hears it, and what the world needs in that moment. Right now, we live in a world hungry for stories of courage that don't fit the usual mold. We want to know that it's possible to be powerful without being cruel. Fierce without being heartless, loyal without being passive. Tomo-guzan is all of those things. She's not perfect. She's not fully known. But she's here. 800 years later, her story still rides beside us. And if we listen closely, we can still hear the echo of hooves on the battlefield. We can still feel the wind tug at the edges of her banner. We can still see her white skin, long hair, eyes like sharpened steel, riding not toward legend, but through it. A woman worth 1,000. Still fighting, still remembered, still winning. Imagine walking into a room where someone just dumped a bucket of human waste out the window onto the street. Now imagine it's normal. Now imagine it happens every day. And now imagine that's still the cleanest part of your day. You've probably seen Victorian Britain portrayed in two ways. Either it's the world of Jane Austen, lace gloves, afternoon teas, candlelit dances, or it's Sherlock Holmes pacing through a foggy alley, trench coats swirling, gas lamp shadows playing on cobblestones. But here's the part the movies don't show. Most people smelled awful. Like, profoundly awful. Because the truth about hygiene in the Victorian era is that it was less about being clean and more about appearing clean. The dirt, the grime, the stink, it was all still there. It just wore a corset. Let's start with the basics. Bathing. If you were rich, you might bathe once a week. If you were poor, maybe once a month. Or, let's be honest, maybe never. Soap was expensive, plumbing was a luxury, and water wasn't always safe. The average person in Victorian London didn't have a bathroom. They had a basin, and maybe a pitcher, and maybe, if they were lucky, access to a public bathhouse once in a while. You'd strip down, splash some water on your face, rub your underarms, and call it a day. Full-body bathing, that was considered excessive, or suspicious, or French. There were, of course, exceptions. Some wealthy Victorians had bathing rooms built into their homes, usually cold, tiled, and only slightly less terrifying than a morgue. The tub might be made of tin or porcelain, filled with buckets of hot water from the kitchen. There were no hot taps, no showers. You had to work for your bath. And God help you if you were the last person to use the tub, because water was not changed between bathers. The family bathed in order, father first, then mother, then children, youngest to oldest. By the end, the bathwater was basically a broth of Victorian soup. Soap was made from lye and animal fat, and often left your skin red, raw, or weirdly sticky. And it smelled industrial. You didn't come out of the bath smelling like lavender. You came out smelling like you'd fought a chemical fire and lost. But let's say you were poor, working class poor, East End poor. What did bathing look like then? It didn't. You cleaned your hands and face in the morning with a damp cloth, maybe scrubbed your feet if they were muddy, and hoped your natural musk wasn't too offensive. Some people carried a handkerchief dabbed in cologne or vinegar to sniff when others got too ripe. Public transit, if you can call it that, was a war zone of body odor. People didn't just accept the smell. They fought it with desperation. That's where perfume came in. The Victorians loved perfume, not just as a luxury, but as a necessity. Scented sachets were tucked into pockets, drawers, even corsets. Some women wore pomanders, little balls filled with herbs, on chains around their necks. Men splashed cologne on their beards to mask the scent of unwashed skin. But no amount of lavender oil could cover everything. Let's talk toilets. In modern homes, a toilet is a given. In Victorian London, not so much. If you lived in a tenement or a slum, you probably used a shared outhouse. These were outdoor brick or wooden structures with a pit beneath. No flushing, no privacy, often no door, and you shared it with all your neighbors. In some areas, one outhouse served hundreds of people. Sewage ran through open gutters in the streets, known charmingly as sewer ditches. Children played beside them. People dumped chamber pots into them. Rats thrived in them. The stench was unbelievable. Travelers from abroad described London as a city under a permanent curse of the nose. Even Queen Victoria herself once reportedly fainted from the smell while driving through the capital. And the problem wasn't just discomfort. It was deadly. Before modern sanitation, diseases like cholera, dysentery, and typhoid were rampant. Entire families died because their water came from the same river where sewage was dumped. The Thames itself was a biological nightmare. In summer, the river festered. The Great Stink of 1858, yes, that was the actual name, was so bad that Parliament had to hang curtains soaked in lime to survive the sessions. Eventually, they built a modern sewage system. But it took time. And until then, people did their best to cope. Upper-class homes used chamber pots and commodes, emptied by servants known as night soil men. These men carried full pots through the streets before dawn, dumping the contents into cesspools or carts. It was a job so revolting that it paid relatively well, by Victorian standards, at least. Tooth care wasn't much better. Toothbrushes existed, but they weren't common, and they weren't pleasant. The bristles were made from animal hair, boar, horse, or even pig, and they fell out constantly. Toothpaste? A homemade paste of crushed chalk, salt, coal dust, or baking soda. If you were lucky, someone added a drop of peppermint. Dentistry was primitive. Cavities were dealt with by extraction. There was no anesthetic. If your tooth hurt, you pulled it, or lived with it. Some people simply removed all their teeth and wore wooden or ivory dentures. George Washington wasn't Victorian, but he set a trend. False teeth became a grim fashion accessory for the decayed smile. And speaking of decay, what about clothes? Victorian fashion was famously elaborate. Layers upon layers. Crinolines, bustles, waistcoats, starched collars. But guess what? Those clothes were rarely washed. Cleaning was expensive and risky. Fabrics were delicate, dyes ran, and washing methods involved harsh chemicals. Instead of laundering clothes, people used undergarments, long chemises, petticoats, undershirts, to absorb sweat and oil. These underlayers were washed regularly. The outer layers? Maybe a few times a year. Some garments were never washed at all. They were brushed, aired out, and sprinkled with perfume. Think of it like dry shampoo, but for everything you wore. The corset, worn tightly against the skin, trapped sweat and dirt, and yet it was never cleaned. The buildup of grime, combined with tight lacing, often led to skin infections, boils, and fainting spells. But appearance mattered more than health. A pale, powdered face and perfumed sleeves were the markers of civility, even if you hadn't bathed in weeks. Hair care was another minefield. Victorian women prized long, flowing hair, but they washed it as little as possible. Water and soap stripped natural oils, so hair was washed maybe once every month or two. Between washings, women used dry powders, pomades, or even a mixture of rum and egg yolk to freshen their locks. They brushed their hair constantly, 100 strokes a night, to distribute oils and remove dirt. This created the illusion of shine, though in truth it just moved the grime around. Men slicked their hair back with brilliantine, a greasy pomade that gave a wet look and reeked of violets. Beards were oiled, waxed, and curled into mustaches sharp enough to poke someone's eye out. Head lice were a constant problem. So were fleas. People wore little cloth caps at night to keep bugs out of their hair and their pillows. And let's not even get started on laundry. Without washing machines, laundry was backbreaking labor. Water had to be fetched and boiled. Clothes were scrubbed by hand on boards. Lye soap ate away at fabric and fingers alike. Drying meant hanging clothes in smoky rooms or outdoors where soot and rain undid the day's work. Some women spent entire Mondays, known as washing day, doing laundry for the family. It was exhausting, brutal work. And yet, for all this, hygiene was becoming a national obsession. Why? Because the Victorians feared disease. Not in a scientific, germ theory sense, at least not at first, but in a moral sense. They believed that cleanliness was next to godliness. That dirt was a sign of sin. That foul smells were not just unpleasant, but dangerous. Miasma theory, the idea that bad air caused illness, ruled the medical world for much of the 19th century. Doctors believed that cholera, typhus, and plague were spread by odor, not microbes. So cleaning the streets, airing out clothes, and burning incense weren't just rituals. They were acts of survival. The irony? They were right, sort of. While miasma theory was wrong, many of the actions it inspired, cleaning streets, improving ventilation, building sewers, actually did reduce disease. The results came before the science caught up. And by the end of the century, things started to change. Soap became cheaper, plumbing more widespread. Public health campaigns taught the value of washing hands, boiling water, and scrubbing floors. Hygiene went from being a rich man's luxury to a working man's duty. But it was a long, dirty, smelly road to get there. And the next time you take a hot shower or flush a toilet, just remember, in Victorian England, that was the stuff of science fiction. If you think the first part was grim, hold on. Because now we're diving into the stranger, darker, and somehow even smellier side of Victorian hygiene. Let's begin with the obsession the Victorians had with bodily functions, but never, ever talking about them. This was a society where people routinely fainted because their corsets were crushing their ribs, but they would rather pass out than mention anything vaguely medical in polite company. It was the golden age of repression. You didn't say the word leg in mixed company, too suggestive. Table legs were sometimes covered with fabric, just in case someone got ideas. The word bathroom was borderline scandalous. You didn't go to the toilet, you retired. Where to? You didn't say. And yet, despite all this social pearl clutching, Victorians were also deeply obsessed with health. Not real health, necessarily, but moral cleanliness, which they believed was reflected in the body. Let's talk deodorant. It didn't exist. The very idea that you might want to block sweat glands was considered unnatural, even dangerous. Instead, Victorians used powders, lots of powders. Talcum powder, starch, even crushed chalk were applied under the arms, between the legs, and in the folds of corsets to soak up sweat and hide odor. These powders didn't prevent sweat, they just masked it. Poorly. Women sometimes wore cotton pads under their arms, sewn into their dresses, to catch sweat. These pads were removable and washable, sort of the ancestor of modern sweat shields. But if you were poor, you didn't have time for pads. You just sweated, and hoped no one noticed. Toiletries, as we understand them today, were just emerging. Tooth powders were sold in tins. Hair tonics came in glass bottles, but they were wildly unregulated. Ingredients ranged from harmless herbs to lead, mercury, arsenic, and ammonia. If it made your hair shine, people didn't ask questions. And this brings us to one of the most unsettling parts of Victorian hygiene: cosmetics. Makeup was technically frowned upon, especially for respectable women. It was associated with actresses, prostitutes, and foreigners, mostly French, of course. But that didn't stop anyone from using it. The goal was to look naturally pale, delicate, and spotless. To achieve that, women used white lead powder to lighten their skin. It gave a smooth, porcelain-like finish. It also caused lead poisoning. Long-term use led to skin sores, hair loss, organ failure, and eventually death. Blush, or rouge, was made from carmine, derived from crushed beetles, red ochre, or mercuric sulfide. Lip stains might use cochineal dye or even red wine. To brighten their eyes, women used belladonna, deadly nightshade, which dilated the pupils and gave a romantic, wide-eyed look. Unfortunately, it also caused blindness. And for those who wanted to go the extra mile, arsenic wafers. Yes, actual arsenic. Arsenic was thought to improve the complexion. It whitened the skin, gave it a slight glow, and thinned the blood. It also destroyed your internal organs, but slowly, so you could look amazing for a little while. Hair was another major battlefield. Wigs were falling out of fashion by the Victorian period, but hairpieces and extensions were still used. And the source? Other people's hair. Poor women, especially in rural areas, often sold their hair for money. Hair dealers would collect, sort, and process these locks into elaborate hairpieces. If you were a wealthy Victorian lady wearing a stylish chignon, it was probably sewn from the hair of a starving orphan. Hair dye was another minefield. Recipes included ingredients like nitrate of silver, lead acetate, and sulfur compounds. The resulting fumes were enough to knock you out, but at least you were fashionable. Now let's pivot to the Victorian laundry industry, because it tells us a lot about gender, labor, and class. Doing laundry was not just domestic work, it was hard, industrial labor. In urban areas, many working-class women made their living as washerwomen. They worked long days scrubbing clothes by hand in boiling water, then wringing them out and hanging them to dry in crowded alleys or smoky yards. The work destroyed their hands, their backs, and often their health. But it was one of the few jobs women could do from home. And while we're here, let's talk about menstruation. Victorian society didn't talk about it. Not publicly, not medically, not even in private, if they could help it. There were no disposable pads, no tampons, no painkillers. Women used rags, which they washed and reused in secret, hence the phrase on the rag. These cloths were pinned to undergarments or held in place with belts or homemade straps. There were early versions of sanitary belts by the late 19th century, but they were awkward, bulky, and incredibly uncomfortable, because menstruation was considered dirty, both physically and morally. Many women were told not to wash during their periods, for fear of letting bad humors in. Doctors gave wildly incorrect advice. Don't read too much, don't ride horses, don't get excited. A woman having her period was supposed to suffer in silence and invisibility. Hygiene products weren't marketed. No one wrote instruction manuals. You learned what to do from your mother, or not at all. Now let's talk about the home itself. What did a clean Victorian home look like? It was dusty, constantly dusty. Coal fires were the norm, and coal soot coated every surface. Even the cleanest home had black grime in the corners. Curtains, rugs, and upholstery had to be beaten regularly to shake out the filth. Floors were scrubbed with carbolic soap. Walls were washed with lime. People used vinegar, turpentine, and ammonia to clean everything. The Victorian house was a chemical war zone. And yet, despite all this, housekeeping was seen as a woman's sacred duty. Manuals like Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management gave detailed instructions for how to clean everything from a hearth to a chamber pot. And if your home wasn't pristine, you were considered morally suspect. Cleanliness wasn't just hygiene, it was identity, especially for women. This was especially true for mothers. A mother who couldn't keep her children clean was seen as failing. And yet, with no running water, no modern disinfectants, and no understanding of bacteria, it was an impossible standard. Children, by the way, were often just as filthy as adults. Working-class kids rarely had access to baths. They played in gutters, handled raw sewage, and shared beds infested with lice and fleas. Disease spread like wildfire in crowded neighborhoods. Infant mortality was staggeringly high. 1 in 5 children didn't make it past age 5, and many of those deaths were linked, directly or indirectly, to poor hygiene. Let's also take a moment for the funeral industry, because the Victorians turned death into a hygiene ritual. Bodies were washed, dressed, and laid out at home, often in the parlor. Mourning clothes were black, heavy, and rarely washed. Widows wore them for a full year. Gloves were worn constantly to prevent the spread of germs, though no one really understood what germs were yet. Embalming was just beginning to catch on, and hygiene played a big role in that. People were afraid of decomposition smells, so they began using chemicals, arsenic again, to preserve corpses. Not for health, necessarily, but for decorum. Even in death, cleanliness mattered. Let's end this part by returning to public health. By the 1880s, reformers began pushing for better standards. Indoor plumbing became more common, slowly. Soap became cheaper thanks to industrial production. Municipal water supplies were treated. Cities began regulating waste. Medical science finally caught up. Louis Pasteur and Joseph Lister revolutionized how we understood disease. Germ theory replaced miasma theory. Hospitals cleaned their tools. Doctors washed their hands. And people started to believe that being clean might not just be a moral good, but a medical one. Still, the road was long. For most of the Victorian era, being clean was a social performance. It didn't mean you were safe. It didn't mean you were healthy. It meant you looked the part. You wore gloves. You powdered your face. You sprinkled rosewater in your hair. And you hoped nobody got close enough to notice the smell. You might think Victorian hygiene couldn't get any more absurd. But we haven't even talked about the children, the men, and the dozens of truly bizarre inventions that were meant to clean your body, or at least your conscience. Let's begin with children, because Victorian childhood hygiene was a paradox, both obsessively managed and completely neglected. Upper-class families kept their children in near-sterile conditions. Nannies washed their faces with rosewater, dressed them in stiff white linen, and powdered their skin. Nurseries were scrubbed daily. But all of this was for appearance. If the child looked clean, that was enough. Behind the scenes, things were less rosy. Bathing a child often meant putting them into lukewarm water once a week, or less. Soap stunk. Hair washing was rare. Teeth cleaning was optional and usually done with a piece of cloth or a chalky powder. There were no toothbrushes specifically for kids. In fact, many children grew up without ever owning a toothbrush at all. For working-class children, hygiene was almost non-existent. These kids worked from a young age, selling newspapers, shining shoes, laboring in factories or mines, and hygiene was a luxury no one could afford. Many of them didn't have shoes, let alone clean water. They drank from public pumps or gutters. Their homes, if you could call a one-room tenement shared by 8 people a home, were breeding grounds for lice, fleas, bedbugs, and disease. But despite these conditions, Victorian society still held mothers responsible for keeping their children presentable. A child covered in soot was a tragedy. A child with dirty fingernails in church was a scandal. Doctors began publishing moralizing guides aimed at mothers, lecturing them on how cleanliness would instill virtue in their children. Because apparently, if you just scrubbed a kid hard enough, he wouldn't grow up to steal bread. Now let's talk about boys becoming men, and how that changed their hygiene expectations. Victorian masculinity was deeply tied to physical strength, composure, and self-restraint. But when it came to personal grooming, things got complicated. Men were expected to be clean, but not too clean. Overwashing was seen as effeminate. A real man was supposed to have a healthy scent. Not stink, but not smell like lavender either. The solution? Bay rum. This was the aftershave of choice for Victorian gentlemen. A blend of bay leaves, cloves, cinnamon, and, of course, rum. It gave off a sharp, spicy aroma and covered up the fact that most men only bathed once a week. Shaving was a daily ritual for the upper classes. Straight razors were standard, and barbershops were popular social hubs. But at home, shaving was a dangerous activity. One slip of the hand, and you might bleed for hours. And beards? They were more than fashion. Many Victorians believed beards filtered disease from the air. Yes, some men actually thought their facial hair worked like a surgical mask. So, growing a beard wasn't laziness, it was science. Sort of. Men didn't use deodorant either. Instead, they powdered their armpits with alum or starch. Some rubbed vinegar on their skin. Others wore undershirts soaked in camphor oil. Nothing really worked, but it showed effort. Now, let's visit the land of the truly strange, the world of Victorian hygiene gadgets. This was an era of invention, and that included tools for keeping your body clean, or at least pretending to. Take, for instance, the nasal douche. This was a device designed to flush out your nostrils with warm salt water. Doctors believed it could prevent illness, cleanse the soul, and improve your memory. It was painful, messy, and probably didn't help much, but it was very fashionable among the health-obsessed. Or consider the ear spoon. Victorians believed earwax was a sign of poor breeding. Clean ears were a mark of civilization. So people used long, delicate spoons to scoop out wax. These were made of ivory, silver, or brass, and often given as gifts. Nothing says, "I care about you," like a personal wax removal tool. Toothbrushes, meanwhile, were undergoing a revolution. Early Victorian brushes had wooden handles and boar bristle heads. These bristles were stiff, unsanitary, and fell out constantly. Some dentists recommended using charcoal or crushed eggshells instead of toothpaste. Others warned against brushing at all, claiming it damaged the gums. Mouthwash, however, was thriving. Victorian mouthwashes came in glass bottles and promised everything from whiter teeth to eternal youth. Ingredients included alcohol, clove oil, peppermint, and, you guessed it, arsenic. One popular product advertised itself as refreshing, invigorating, and mildly antiseptic, which meant it probably burned your throat and stripped your enamel. Let's not forget the foot hygiene industry, which exploded during the Victorian period. This was the age of long walks, tight boots, and heavy stockings. Feet were constantly sweating, and since socks were rarely washed, the smell was catastrophic. Foot powders, foot baths, and scented insoles became common. Some people even wore copper-lined shoe inserts, believing they would absorb odor and prevent disease. Others simply sprinkled lavender into their boots and hoped for the best. For women, high-heeled boots and narrow toes made foot pain inevitable. Corns, bunions, and blisters were rampant, but no one complained. Suffering was fashionable. Now, if you've ever wondered whether Victorians thought about bad breath, the answer is yes. Constantly, bad breath, or foulness of the mouth, was linked to moral decay. Dentists sold tongue scrapers made of silver. People chewed parsley, fennel seeds, or licorice root to mask odor. Some even carried tiny bottles of perfume to dab on the tongue. Not effective, but quite dramatic. One manual from 1872 suggested that bad breath could be cured by drinking only warm milk for 5 days and swearing off red meat. Another advised rubbing lemon on the gums after every meal. And then there were the home enemas. The Victorians were obsessed with internal cleanliness. Many believed that keeping the bowels clear was the key to a healthy life and moral virtue. Enema kits were sold in catalogs, often under euphemistic names like internal irrigators. People used them regularly. Some households had family syringes that everyone shared. Others used herbal enemas to cleanse the spirits. The logic was simple. If you were bloated, tired, or even melancholic, it was probably your colon misbehaving. Hydrotherapy spas, also known as water cure clinics, flourished across England and America. Patients bathed in freezing pools, had buckets of ice water dumped on them, or lay in damp sheets for hours. The goal? Purification. The result? Hypothermia, mostly. Let's zoom out for a moment and talk about smell. To modern noses, the Victorian world probably stank. Even in upper-class homes, the mix of coal smoke, chamber pots, unwashed bodies, damp wool, and animal hair created an unforgettable aroma. That's why perfumes weren't just a luxury. They were a survival tool. Perfumery boomed during the 19th century. Scents ranged from floral and citrus to heavy musks and spices. But beware, many of these were made with whale vomit, ambergris, civet musk from the glands of wild cats, or oil of cloves, which caused skin rashes. Women often dabbed perfume on their handkerchiefs and held them to their noses while walking through the city. It wasn't just dainty, it was defense. Men wore cologne under their arms and on their hair. Some added drops of oil of turpentine to their bathwater to freshen the skin. A terrible idea, but very on-brand for the era. And then, of course, we arrive at the public baths. By the late 19th century, as urban populations exploded, public bathhouses began to appear in cities. These were often built by philanthropists or reformers who believed that cleanliness could elevate the poor. The facilities were basic: rows of wooden stalls with cold or lukewarm water, communal towels, and one bar of shared soap. But for people who had never owned a bathtub, they were revolutionary. Unfortunately, many saw these spaces as morally suspicious. Naked bodies in close proximity? Scandalous. So public bathhouses often imposed strict rules. No talking, no loitering, no looking. Just scrub, rinse, and leave. Some communities resisted bathhouses altogether, believing they would encourage vanity or idleness. Others embraced them as the first step toward a cleaner, more civilized society. Let's wrap up this section with a thought. The Victorians lived in a constant state of tension between shame and obsession. They were ashamed of their bodies, their smells, and their natural functions. But they were also obsessed with controlling, masking, and perfecting every aspect of personal hygiene. They invented, experimented, and even poisoned themselves in pursuit of an ideal that was always just out of reach. And in the process, they laid the groundwork for modern hygiene. Even if they did it while wearing a corset, brushing their teeth with brick dust, and bathing once a month. By the late Victorian period, the tides of hygiene were finally beginning to turn. The smell still lingered. The soap still stung. But something had shifted, not just in the habits of individuals, but in how society understood the human body itself. It all began with germs. For most of the 19th century, people believed in miasma theory, the idea that bad air caused disease. It made sense in a way. Poor areas smelled worse, and people there got sick more often. Clearly, the stench was killing them, right? Enter Louis Pasteur, Joseph Lister, and the birth of germ theory. These men, through careful observation and shocking amounts of cow guts, proved that diseases weren't spread by foul air, but by microscopic organisms invisible to the naked eye. Suddenly, everything changed. Cleanliness wasn't just cosmetic anymore, it was life-saving. Doctors began washing their hands between surgeries. Hospitals started sterilizing tools. And slowly, painfully, the Victorian world began to accept that cleanliness wasn't a moral issue, but a medical necessity. But the public didn't convert overnight. Old habits, as we know, die hard, and Victorian habits clung like soot to a chimney sweep. Let's talk about soap, that humble but revolutionary bar. In early Victorian times, soap was homemade or bought in crumbly gray slabs. It smelled like lard and lye, and could remove skin if used too eagerly. Most people hated it. But by the 1880s, soap became a status symbol. Companies like Pears began marketing soap not just as a cleanser, but as a path to civility. Their advertisements didn't just sell hygiene, they sold identity. Posters showed delicate women bathing in marble tubs, surrounded by lace curtains and flower petals. The message was clear. If you were clean, you were refined. If you used Pears soap, you were practically royalty. And the advertising worked. Victorian households began proudly displaying their soap dishes. Giving soap as a gift became fashionable. Even lower-class families made sacrifices to buy small cakes of perfumed soap, if only to appear respectable. This marketing revolution didn't stop with soap. It spread to toothpaste, mouthwash, skin creams, and even deodorant powders. Hygiene became an industry, and that industry became an empire. Meanwhile, public reformers began fighting for broader sanitary changes. Sewage systems were expanded. Public toilets, called comfort stations, were built in city parks. Street cleaning became an actual job, rather than something rain occasionally handled. The Great Stink of 1858, when the Thames turned into a river of liquid sewage, finally convinced Parliament to invest in proper plumbing. And in homes that could afford it, the chamber pot was slowly replaced by something miraculous: the indoor flush toilet. Yes, the water closet, once a novelty of the rich, began making its way into respectable middle-class homes. But even here, Victorian logic still had a foot in the past. For years, people believed that flushing too often could damage your health or your pipes. Some families still emptied waste by hand rather than trust the mysterious power of moving water. It wasn't just the elite who were learning, though. Working-class families, factory workers, and coal miners all began engaging with hygiene in new ways. Public health campaigns were launched in schools. Children were taught to wash their hands, brush their teeth, and use clean handkerchiefs. Posters urged women to boil water, air out bedding, and sweep under furniture. Hygiene became a form of national duty. In the army, soldiers were drilled not just in marching, but in cleaning, scrubbing their barracks, washing their uniforms, and bathing, when possible. Disease killed more men than bullets, and the military finally understood the value of soap. Even the church changed its tune. Clergy had once warned that too much concern with cleanliness was vanity. But by the 1890s, many preachers were praising cleanliness as a godly virtue. Cleanliness is next to godliness wasn't just a proverb, it was practically a sermon series. But perhaps the most profound shift occurred in the private realm, the bathroom itself. At the start of the century, few homes had a dedicated space for bathing. Most washing happened in the kitchen or in front of the fireplace. But by the 1890s, the modern bathroom was born. Tiles, sinks, taps, tubs with claw feet, indoor plumbing, water heaters, if you were lucky. It was still a luxury, but it was no longer unthinkable. Bathrooms became symbols of prosperity and progress. Entire catalogs were devoted to bathroom fixtures. A clean bathroom was no longer eccentric, it was desirable. And this shift brought with it a new attitude: privacy. In early Victorian homes, bathing and bodily functions were communal, casual, sometimes even humorous. By the century's end, these acts became intensely private. Doors were closed, curtains were drawn. Cleanliness became not just public performance, but personal ritual. This privacy brought shame, but also intimacy. A child learning to wash behind their ears. A woman inspecting her teeth in a small mirror. A man choosing between shaving or letting his beard grow wild. Hygiene was no longer about survival. It was about identity. And yet, for all this change, some things never quite left the past. Superstitions persisted. People still believed cold air caused illness. Some refused to bathe during menstruation or pregnancy. Others thought too much water weakened the body. Even among the educated, bathing a baby more than once a week was seen as reckless. Washing your hair too often was dangerous. And, of course, enemas were still considered the secret to a long, noble life. Victorian hygiene was caught between two worlds, the ancient and the modern, the spiritual and the scientific, the filthy and the obsessively clean. But make no mistake, this was the century where everything changed. By the dawn of the 20th century, the groundwork was laid for our current expectations, that bathing is normal, that bad breath can be fixed, that clean water is a right, and that a toothbrush is just part of being human. So, next time you step into a warm shower, lather up some pleasantly scented soap, or floss your teeth without a second thought. Remember this. There was a time, not so long ago, when people scrubbed themselves with sand, powdered their armpits with starch, and thought beards could filter cholera. And that time shaped the world we live in. Not because they got everything right, but because, through all their confusion and contradictions, they refused to settle for filth. They believed that humanity could be better, cleaner, more dignified. Even if it meant bathing in vinegar, sniffing rosewater on a rag, or trusting a bar of soap made with whale vomit. The Victorians may have lived in a world of grime, but they dreamed of a world of grace. And in that dream, we can still smell the lingering scent of lavender and coal smoke, fading now, but not forgotten. They say cheese only gets better with age, but in the Middle Ages, age often meant decay, disease, and in some cases, death. Before you slice that wedge, you might want to hear the tale of how cheese could destroy reputations, health, and entire villages. You might think of cheese today as a comforting food, creamy, sharp, savory, maybe enjoyed with wine or fruit. But in the medieval world, cheese was far more than a food. It was a gamble. It was superstition. And at times, it was a weapon. If you lived in a small 13th century village, cheese could heal your stomach or kill you where you stood. And worse still, you might never even know it was the cheese. Let's begin with what cheese actually meant to a medieval person. It wasn't merely something stored in the pantry or brought out for guests. It was a symbol of local identity, a source of livelihood, and in some monasteries, even a path to God. Nearly every household kept some form of cheese. Fresh cheese, called green cheese, was eaten young, within a few days. Aged cheese was a luxury, and some varieties could be stored for months, assuming, of course, that the mold didn't get to it first. And yet, mold was often the point. In a time before microbiology, the aging of cheese was a sacred mystery. Certain cheeses were considered safe only because they'd always been made that way. No one really understood why some cheeses bloomed with beautiful blue veins and others curdled into poison. The distinction between food and rot was razor thin. Cheesemakers relied not on science, but on inherited wisdom, cloudy memory, and weather patterns. A sudden storm or a warm cellar could turn your wheel of cheddar into a wheel of death. But people kept eating it. Why? Because the alternatives were worse. Most medieval diets lacked protein. Meat was rare, especially for peasants. Beans were common, but often poorly cooked. Milk couldn't be kept long, especially in summer. Cheese, then, became one of the only reliable proteins available year-round, if you could avoid the risks. One such risk was ergotism, also known as St. Anthony's fire. Though more famously linked to contaminated rye, there are records of cheese causing mass illness in regions where dairy animals grazed on certain poisonous plants. In these cases, the toxins passed into their milk, and when the milk was turned into cheese, the danger was sealed inside. The results were horrifying: hallucinations, convulsions, burning sensations in the limbs, and in many cases, death. In parts of France and Germany, entire families would fall ill at once after a bad batch of cheese. In England, local authorities sometimes ordered cheesemakers punished, fined, or even exiled when contaminated curds spread through a village. It didn't help that food inspections, when they happened at all, were more about appearances than health. If a cheese looked solid and smelled strong, it passed. But what counted as a good smell in the Middle Ages was not what you might imagine. In some places, the stinkier the cheese, the better. A pungent aroma meant potency, aging, and richness. But it could also mean decay. This confusion only deepened when religious orders became involved. Monasteries across Europe, especially in Italy and France, developed some of the earliest and most respected cheese-making traditions. Their cheeses were often prized, sold at markets, and even gifted to nobles. But they were also made in stone-walled cellars, close to other fermenting substances: wine, beer, meat. The air was thick, the tools unwashed, the workers rarely bathed. One 12th century Benedictine monk described the cheese-aging room as a place where the breath of angels meets the sweat of the earth. That may sound poetic, but he was probably just describing mold spores. Still, these monastic cheeses were considered divine, despite the fact that more than a few caused intestinal mayhem. And here we must talk about another fear: demons. Yes, demons and cheese. It was widely believed in some medieval communities that certain cheeses could attract evil spirits. Particularly in the Alps, villagers whispered about cheeses that screamed, when cut, crackling with gas from poor fermentation. Some claimed this was the sign of a cursed curd. A cheese that whistled or hissed when sliced might be discarded, buried, or even exorcised by the local priest. No one wanted to be the victim of a demon dairy. Even worse were the suspicions that cheese could be used in witchcraft. Accusations flew in times of famine, when someone's herd failed or a neighbor's cheese rotted too quickly. Witches were said to spoil milk, curdle cream from across town, or enchant a cheese to bring illness to anyone who consumed it. One infamous case from 1324 Ireland involved a woman accused of cheese poisoning, allegedly placing a cursed wedge into her enemy's larder. The man fell ill for days, and the woman was dragged before a tribunal. Her sentence: flogging and exile. No one questioned whether the cheese had simply spoiled. Even among the upper classes, cheese was a source of drama. Banquet hosts competed for the finest foreign cheeses: Roquefort from France, Parmesan from Italy, Stilton from England. These were not served casually. They were announced with fanfare, sliced at the table, and paired with honey or nuts. But these cheeses often traveled weeks to arrive, and with no refrigeration, they changed along the way. A once pristine wedge might arrive sweating, oozing, and covered in unidentified growths. Still, to refuse a taste was to insult your host. Some nobles even died for their pride. There's an oft-repeated tale of a 14th century Bohemian duke who insisted on consuming an entire wheel of imported cheese despite the pleas of his cook, who noted its unusual smell. The duke refused to be mocked for rejecting a gift, and died 2 days later of what modern historians suspect was food-borne botulism. Whether the story is apocryphal or not, it reflects a real truth. Cheese could kill you, and no one would ever know for sure. Let's not forget about preservation. Before the advent of wax sealing, cheese was preserved in all sorts of creative and sometimes revolting ways. Some were wrapped in leaves. Others were stored in ashes, buried in sand, or coated in lard. There's even evidence of cheeses aged inside hollowed-out skulls. These techniques worked, but inconsistently. The line between preservation and contamination was thin, and many a peasant's supper turned into a long night of stomach agony. And yet, cheese endured. It persisted. It was beloved. So beloved, in fact, that entire fairs were built around it. Cheese markets were held in cathedral courtyards, town squares, and even castle halls. People sang songs about cheese. They argued over texture. Children were named after dairy saints. Cheese became a centerpiece of not just meals, but of identity. And in this strange, smelly, sacred, deadly world, the cheese wheel kept turning. Let's now step beyond village kitchens and monastic cellars, and explore how cheese in the Middle Ages became entangled in social class, superstition, law, and even battlefield survival. To begin with, not all cheese was created equal, and neither were the people eating it. In wealthier circles, particularly among the nobility and upper clergy, cheese was regarded with a complicated mix of indulgence and suspicion. On one hand, it was a luxury, especially foreign varieties that arrived from distant abbeys in France or Italy. On the other hand, it was considered a peasant food, rustic, earthy, and unrefined. For this reason, noble households often only served cheese as part of the final course of a banquet, paired with pears, nuts, or mead, and occasionally sprinkled with sugar or exotic spices like cinnamon. Its presence was muted, almost apologetic. However, for the peasantry, cheese was daily bread. Literally, it was served with bread nearly every day, especially during long agricultural work seasons. Green cheese, soft and fresh, was eaten quickly. Aged cheeses were stored with care, often wrapped in cloth and hidden in cool earthen cellars. Some peasants even bartered cheese in place of coin. In hard winters, cheese was eaten mold and all, unless the mold was black, in which case it might be scraped off with a knife blessed by a priest. This obsession with purification wasn't just spiritual. It was practical. Peasants could not afford to waste food. But even they recognized that cheese could be deadly when left too long. Home remedies developed to clean questionable wedges. One included soaking cheese in vinegar. Another involved leaving it overnight in milk from a white goat, which was thought to absorb bad humors. If the goat died the next day, well, that answered the question. Oddly enough, the military also had a vested interest in cheese safety. During extended campaigns, especially in the 100 Years' War and the Crusades, cheese became an essential ration. It was dense in calories, didn't require cooking, and could last for weeks if kept dry. Soldiers received hard, dry cheeses that could be carried in cloth sacks, sometimes paired with salted meat or coarse bread. In some cases, these cheeses were so tough they had to be soaked in wine or broth before eating. There's a famous anecdote from a Burgundian mercenary who broke a tooth on a cheese cannonball, as he called it. And yet, spoiled cheese on the battlefield wasn't just unpleasant, it could decimate entire units. One documented case from the 13th century describes an outbreak of severe food poisoning among the troops of a minor French lord after they consumed aged cheese infested with mites. The result? Mass vomiting, diarrhea, and an abrupt retreat from the siege they were attempting. The enemy didn't win the battle. The cheese did. But this isn't the only example of cheese interfering in the affairs of state. In 1295, a cheese-related scandal rocked the court of Castile when a diplomat from Aragon gifted King Sancho a wheel of goat cheese during treaty negotiations. The cheese was spoiled, rancid to the core. The king took this as an insult, suspecting an assassination attempt, and stormed out of the talks. War nearly erupted over that single wheel. Historians still debate whether it was a genuine mistake or a cunning diplomatic sabotage. Either way, it reveals just how personal and political cheese could be. Then there's the law. In many medieval cities, the sale of food was regulated by guilds. These guilds controlled who could sell what, and under what conditions. Cheesemakers and dairy merchants formed their own guilds in places like Paris, London, and Cologne. These groups enforced strict rules. Cheeses had to be inspected, weighed, and sometimes even tasted by a guild-appointed cheese examiner before being sold. Markets that violated these rules risked hefty fines, or worse. Public shaming was common. In 1372, a London cheesemonger was found guilty of selling rotten cow's cheese, which had caused severe illness amongst several customers. His punishment? He was forced to walk through the city with a rope of spoiled cheese tied around his neck, followed by a boy ringing a bell and shouting, "Beware the cheese of Master Hoggins." In another case, a woman in Bruges was fined for blending plaster powder into her soft cheese to make it appear firmer. She defended herself by claiming the plaster was medicinal. The magistrate disagreed and sentenced her to 3 days in the stocks, where people pelted her with cheese. Food fraud was serious, but cheese fraud was uniquely dangerous. People were incredibly superstitious about it. For example, some believed that if cheese curdled unexpectedly, it was an omen of betrayal or misfortune. A failed batch in a monastic kitchen might be interpreted as a sign that someone in the order had sinned. Similarly, if cheese grew dark mold patterns that resembled crosses or faces, villagers often gathered to view it, hoping for a message from beyond. Some even preserved these wheels in shrines or chapels, convinced they were holy signs. Meanwhile, others feared these signs were evil. Cursed cheeses, or black wheels, were associated with illness and crop failure. There were even traveling cheese diviners who claimed they could read the future from a mold pattern or the texture of a cracked rind. These so-called experts were equal parts fraudster, herbalist, and local celebrity. Some were believed to cast blessings over cheese sellers to keep them safe from demons or jealous neighbors. All of this brings us to the church's relationship with cheese. On the surface, it was enthusiastic. Monasteries produced some of the best and most beloved cheeses of the Middle Ages. Cistercian monks in Normandy developed an early version of camembert. Benedictine monks in what is now Switzerland pioneered Alpine cheese, using wooden presses and copper kettles. These cheeses were known not just for their flavor, but for their supposed purity made by hands devoted to God. But as always, theology had its complications. The church taught that gluttony was a sin. In rich, indulgent cheeses flirted with gluttony. Certain church leaders condemned the consumption of soft, creamy cheeses as luxuriant. One bishop in 1156 wrote that the unctuous curd melts the soul into sloth and banned it from Lenten meals. Other theologians debated whether cheese broke fasts, especially since it came from animals. The debate was so heated that some orders allowed only aged cheese on fasting days, considering it more dead than living. And yet, cheese never disappeared from church tables. Even popes enjoyed it. In fact, Pope Clement VI reportedly ordered special cheeses from Flanders for Easter feasts, including one made with crushed walnuts and a rind soaked in wine. So while preachers warned about temptation, they often gave in themselves, albeit in the name of refined taste. Beyond Europe, cheese carried other dangers. Travelers along the Silk Road reported that fermented yak cheese served in Tibetan camps was so strong it burned the tongue and clouded the mind. In Islamic regions, where cheese was also popular, it was often salted heavily to ensure preservation, but the salt made it difficult to digest, especially when eaten in hot weather. And in Eastern Europe, cheese stored in sealed jars sometimes exploded due to trapped gas. This led to legends about cursed cheese jars killing the curious. Returning to Western Europe, cheese continued to blur the line between comfort and threat. Even in literature, it played symbolic roles. In Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, the miller is described with a breath that stank of cheese and ale, suggesting both earthiness and decay. Other works use cheese to signal class, lust, corruption, or even cowardice. A knight who refused cheese before battle might be mocked for having a milkmaid's courage. A maiden who gifted a suitor cheese was said to be offering her favor, and possibly more. We cannot overlook one more vital aspect of medieval cheese: gender. Women dominated the domestic cheese trade. Most household cheese was made by women, and in many towns, women sold it at market. Cheese was one of the few products that allowed women to earn income independently. Some even became well known for their cheeses, earning nicknames like Curd Kate or Mary Moldhand. But success brought danger. A woman whose cheese outsold her neighbors might be accused of sorcery or seduction. Cheese could be sexualized, demonized, or sanctified, all depending on who made it and who ate it. In one bizarre case from Verona, a nun was accused of seducing a priest with cheese perfumed with lilies. What this actually means remains a mystery, but the priest was defrocked, and the nun was relocated. So there we have it, a world where cheese was more than just food. It was faith, fear, politics, power, and punishment. And we're only halfway through. Some medieval cheese wasn't just dangerous, it was practically a biological weapon. But before you cancel your next cheese platter, consider how the people of the Middle Ages made sense of curdled danger, from miasmas to madness, and what happens when dairy and folklore melt together. Throughout the medieval period, illness was never just about germs, because no one knew what a germ was. Sickness was instead a chaotic cocktail of theology, superstition, and observation filtered through deeply flawed lenses. If you ate cheese and became ill, the culprit wasn't spoiled milk or listeria. It might have been an imbalance of humors, divine punishment, or the whisper of witchcraft. To understand the fear, we must return to the idea of humoral theory, the dominant framework of health from ancient Greece through the Renaissance. According to this belief, the body was governed by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Good health meant balance. Illness meant one was in excess. Cheese, rich and often difficult to digest, was seen as dangerously cold and moist, an ideal catalyst for throwing the body out of harmony. A person who overindulged might suffer bloating, melancholy, or worse. Some physicians even warned that aged cheeses encouraged the production of black bile, the humor associated with sadness, nightmares, and madness. As a result, cheese was often labeled a phlegmatic food, mucus-inducing, slow-moving, and depressing. Monastic medical texts sometimes advised avoiding cheese altogether, especially the hard or moldy kinds. Yet paradoxically, monks were also some of the finest cheesemakers in Europe, renowned for their expertise. This created a sort of pious paradox. cheese was a sin and a salvation depending on who made it, how it was eaten, and, importantly, what class you belonged to. You see, the medieval poor didn't have the luxury of avoiding cheese. When meat was too expensive and vegetables too seasonal, cheese was a necessary staple. But it was also more likely to be homemade or bought from street vendors without regulation, aging protocols, or any form of sanitation. This is where things got truly dangerous. Spoiled cheese could be riddled with molds, maggots, and bacteria that made people violently ill. Symptoms of foodborne illness, vomiting, cramps, fever could begin within hours. But lacking modern knowledge, sufferers often interpreted these events as spiritual attacks. A bad wedge of cheese might be blamed on a neighbor's curse or a midnight pact with the devil. And what's worse, cheese was sometimes used as the weapon. Poisoning through food had a long, paranoid history. In some royal courts, the idea of a cheese laced with deadly herbs was not just a fear, it was a known tactic. Histories are full of paranoid kings and noblemen avoiding cheese altogether during political instability. One court chronicler in 13th century Sicily noted that a high-ranking official refused to eat cheese in public, fearing his enemies would lace it with nightshade or hemlock. Another story from Burgundy speaks of a cheese sent as a gift that left 2 entire households bedridden within a day. The danger extended beyond health to the social sphere. In medieval villages, being a woman who made or sold cheese could be a risky business. If a customer became ill, the cheesemaker might be accused not just of bad hygiene but of witchcraft. Several recorded witch trials in the 15th century involved dairy-related accusations, curdling milk with a glance, causing cheese to rot on the shelf, or using cheese as a vessel for curses. One record from the Swiss canton of Valais details a woman accused of bewitching a shepherd's cheese, after he claimed that eating it caused his cows to miscarry and his dreams to be plagued by fiery goats. Even if you survived eating it, cheese still came with strange taboos. For example, some people believed that eating cheese during certain moon phases could alter your dreams or even your soul. A 14th century French almanac warned against consuming cheese under a waxing moon unless you wished to dream of serpents or drown in visions of the sea. In Italy, cheese was considered dangerous during Lent, not just for religious reasons, but because it was thought to stir carnal desires. Some moralists went so far as to claim that cheese, like wine, inflamed the flesh and dulled the spirit. In more rural areas, cheese took on an almost mythical quality. Folktales from the Alps and Slavic regions tell of cursed cheese wheels that rolled on their own, glowed faintly at night, or whispered if left in silence. In one tale from 15th century Bavaria, a cursed cheese wheel was said to drive an entire village mad, until a priest dunked it in holy water and buried it under the church steps. And still, people kept eating cheese. Why? Because it was delicious. Because it was practical. Because it preserved calories for the long winter. Cheese, like bread or beer, was an anchor of medieval life, half sacred, half suspicious. The contradictions were baked into the culture. Cheese was celebrated in festivals and feared in whispers. It was both nourishment and nightmare. By the late Middle Ages, cheese even began to influence art and satire. There are marginalia in illuminated manuscripts, those strange little drawings on the edges of pages that show peasants wrestling cheese wheels, chasing runaway curds, or bowing before enormous hunks of dairy like saints. In one particularly absurd depiction, a knight does battle with a sentient cheese that swings a spoon like a flail. These images were humorous, but they reflected real anxieties. Cheese, after all, was unstable. It could nourish you or ruin you. It represented everything the medieval world feared: hidden decay, corruption beneath the surface, and transformation that couldn't be trusted. And speaking of transformation, let's not forget the most bizarre chapter in cheese's medieval reputation: the alleged creation of cheese monsters. In 15th century Bohemia, some believed that if you left a certain kind of cheese out during a thunderstorm, it could come to life. One chronicler even wrote about a curdling of the spirit that produced tiny, writhing creatures inside cheese wheels left under certain planetary alignments. Though modern historians mostly interpret these as mold or maggot infestations, the people of the time didn't separate the biological from the supernatural. To them, a cheese that twitched was a cheese possessed. These beliefs lingered into the Renaissance and beyond. Even as scientific thought began to take root, rural folk medicine continued to warn against cheese rot, not just as a health hazard, but as a moral and spiritual threat. A bad batch wasn't just a mistake, it was a sign that something, somewhere, had gone wrong in the order of the world. And yet, despite its dangers, cheese never left the table. It remained a part of feasts, pilgrim meals, fasting rituals, and common suppers. It was beloved, even as it betrayed.